Hi friends, if you're enjoying my videos, please hit the like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm notice me. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. I am the youngest daughter in a large Hispanic family, born into a world shaped by my father's experiences. Growing up, I was both fascinated and terrified by the stories he would tell, particularly one that used to give me nightmares as a child. This tale, set in the early 1970s, is etched into my memory, a stark reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown. My father, Javier, was a man forged by adversity. Standing at just over 5 feet tall due to his Japanese ancestry, he carried himself with a fierce pride that seemed to make him tower over others. His life had been far from easy, marked by a childhood that could only be described as devastating. The hardships he endured left him with a chip on his shoulder and an attitude that screamed, "Don't mess with me." Javier was an outdoorsman through and through. The wilderness was his second home, a place where he felt truly alive. He was never without a weapon, believing that nature, while beautiful, could turn deadly in an instant. This cautious approach to the wild was juxtaposed with his reckless relationship with alcohol. He would often indulge in what he called liquid courage, a habit that would prove to be both a comfort and a curse. Our home in Sierra Madre, nestled in the wooded mountains of Mexico, was a place of contradictions. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable, with towering pines and rugged peaks that seemed to touch the sky. But beneath this serene exterior lurked dangers both natural and, as my father would discover, potentially supernatural. As a child, I would listen to my father recount his tale with a mix of awe and terror. His eyes would grow distant, and his voice would drop to a whisper as if he feared that speaking too loudly might summon the horrors he had faced. It was a story that would come to define not only his life but also shape my understanding of the world and the thin veil that separates reality from nightmare. Little did I know then that this story, which I'm about to share with you, would haunt me well into adulthood. It's a tale of survival, of facing the unknown, and of the primal fear that lives within us all. As I recount these events, I ask you to remember that this is not a work of fiction, but a true account of a night that forever changed my father and, by extension, our entire family. The night in question began like many others in Sierra Madre. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the mountains shrouded in a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow everything in its path. Javier had spent the evening at a local cantina, indulging in his usual vices, tequila and tall tales. As the hour grew late, he decided it was time to make the journey home. The trip from the cantina to our family home was a 2-hour ride on horseback, a journey Javier had made countless times before. He saddled up his trusted steed, a sturdy brown mare named Luna, and set off into the night. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. As Javier rode, the effects of the alcohol began to take hold. His vision blurred slightly, and the world around him seemed to sway in time with Luna's steady gait. He wasn't concerned. This was a familiar state for him, one in which he often found a strange sense of clarity. The trail wound through dense forest, the trees looming on either side like silent sentinels. The only sounds were the rhythmic clip-clop of Luna's hooves on the hard-packed earth and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was in this eerie quiet that Javier first heard it, a voice calling his name. Javier! The sound was faint, barely more than a whisper on the wind. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of his inebriated mind. But then it came again, louder this time. Hey, Javier! The voice was raspy, unfamiliar, and seemed to come from somewhere in the depths of the forest. Despite the darkness that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction, Javier felt a surge of bravado. He called back, his words slurred but defiant. "Who's there? How do you know my name?" Silence was his only answer, and for a moment, Javier thought perhaps he had imagined the whole thing. He urged Luna forward, eager to put distance between himself and the unseen caller. But the voice persisted, growing in volume and intensity with each repetition. Javier! Hey, Javier! As the calls continued, a sense of unease began to creep over Javier. The darkness seemed to press in around him, and the familiar forest took on a sinister aspect. Luna, too, began to show signs of distress, her ears flicking back and forth nervously. Suddenly, without warning, Luna reared up on her hind legs, whinnying in terror. Javier, caught off guard and dulled by alcohol, lost his grip on the reins. He tumbled backward, his foot catching in the stirrup as he fell. Luna, driven by pure animal instinct, took off at a gallop, dragging Javier face down behind her. The world became a blur of pain and confusion as Javier was pulled along the rough ground. Rocks and branches tore at his clothes and skin, and he could taste blood in his mouth. He struggled to free himself, but the combination of fear, alcohol, and the relentless motion made it nearly impossible. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes, Javier's foot finally came free from the stirrup. He rolled to a stop on the forest floor, battered and disoriented. Luna's hoofbeats faded into the distance as she continued her panicked flight. As Javier lay there trying to catch his breath and assess his injuries, he became acutely aware of the silence that had fallen over the forest. The night creatures had gone quiet, as if holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. And then, cutting through the stillness, came that voice again, closer now, and filled with a malevolent glee that made Javier's blood run cold. Javier, it called, no longer a whisper but a guttural growl. I've found you, Javier. In that moment, as he struggled to his feet, Javier realized that his ordeal was far from over. Something was out there in the darkness. Something that knew his name and meant him harm. And he was alone, injured and unarmed in a forest that suddenly seemed as alien and hostile as another planet. As Javier stumbled to his feet, the full extent of his injuries became apparent. His clothes were torn and bloodied, and every movement sent waves of pain through his battered body. But physical discomfort was the least of his worries. The voice that had been calling his name had fallen silent, but Javier could sense a presence nearby, watching and waiting. The forest, once so familiar to him, now seemed like a maze of shadows and hidden dangers. Every tree could be concealing a threat, every rustle of leaves a potential attack. Javier tried to orient himself, to figure out which direction would lead him home, but the darkness and his own fear made it nearly impossible. He took a tentative step forward, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his ankle. It wasn't broken, but it was definitely sprained. The realization that he couldn't run, even if he wanted to, sent a fresh wave of terror through him. He was trapped, injured, and at the mercy of whatever was out there. Javier's hand instinctively went to his hip, searching for the pistol he usually carried. But it wasn't there. In his haste to leave the cantina, he had left it behind. The absence of the weapon left him feeling naked and vulnerable. A twig snapped somewhere to his left, and Javier whirled around, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. "Show yourself," he shouted, trying to inject bravado into his voice. But the words came out as more of a frightened croak. The response was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything Javier had ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between that defied classification. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. Part of Javier wanted to curl up on the ground and wait for dawn, hoping that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. But a deeper, more primal part of him knew that to give up would mean certain death. With no other option, Javier began to move. He limped forward, using the trees for support, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every few steps, he would pause and listen, straining his ears for any sign of pursuit. The growls continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, as if the creature was circling him, toying with its prey. Javier's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had heard stories, of course, tales told around campfires of beasts that roamed these mountains. But he had always dismissed them as superstition, the product of too much tequila and overactive imaginations. Now, as he stumbled through the dark forest with an unseen predator on his heels, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched. What if there really were things out here that defied explanation? The thought made him shudder. As he moved, Javier tried to piece together a plan. He needed to find shelter, somewhere he could defend himself or at least hide until daylight. But in the darkness, with his limited mobility, every direction looked the same. Suddenly, the growling stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. Javier froze, hardly daring to breathe. He could feel eyes on him, watching from the shadows. The air seemed to grow thick and heavy, charged with a malevolent energy. Then, without warning, something struck him from behind with incredible force. Javier was lifted off his feet and thrown through the air as if he weighed nothing at all. He crashed into a tree trunk, the impact driving the air from his lungs. As he lay there, gasping for breath, Javier caught a glimpse of his attacker. In the dim moonlight that filtered through the trees, he saw a massive shape, far larger than any animal he knew. It moved with an unnatural grace, more like a shadow-given form than a flesh-and-blood creature. Terror, unlike anything he had ever known, gripped Javier. This was no ordinary predator. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in the rational world he thought he knew. As the creature advanced, Javier scrambled backwards, his hands scrabbling in the dirt for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a rock and he hurled it with all his might. The stone passed right through the shadowy form as if it were made of smoke. Javier's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by the fall from his horse. But the pain in his body and the very real sense of danger told him otherwise. This was no dream. This was a waking nightmare, and he was living it. The creature lunged forward, and Javier felt its hot breath on his face. The stench of decay and something else, something alien and indescribable, filled his nostrils. He closed his eyes, certain that his last moment had come. But instead of the killing blow he expected, Javier felt himself being lifted once again. The world spun around him as he was carried through the forest at impossible speed. Trees whipped past in a blur, branches tearing at his skin. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the movement stopped. Javier found himself flung to the ground in a small clearing. He lay there, dazed and disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As his vision cleared, he realized he was at the edge of a steep ravine. The creature that had carried him there was nowhere to be seen, but Javier could feel its presence nearby, watching and waiting. He crawled to the edge of the ravine and peered down. The drop was dizzying, disappearing into darkness. Javier knew he had a choice to make: stay and face whatever had brought him here, or take his chances with the fall. As he weighed his options, that raspy voice spoke again, closer than ever. "Choose, Javier," it said, the words dripping with malice. "Choose your fate." Javier closed his eyes, said a silent prayer, and made his decision. With his heart pounding in his ears and every instinct screaming at him to run, Javier made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He chose the ravine. Without allowing himself time to second-guess his decision, Javier threw himself over the edge of the cliff. The moment of freefall seemed to stretch into eternity. The wind rushed past him, carrying with it the creature's enraged howl. It was a sound of fury and frustration, the cry of a predator denied its prey. Javier's body slammed into the steep slope of the ravine. Rocks and vegetation tore at his clothes and skin as he tumbled downward. He tried to control his descent, to grab onto something to slow his fall, but the slope was too steep and his momentum too great. Pain exploded through every part of his body as he bounced and rolled. He could taste blood in his mouth, and one of his arms hung at an unnatural angle. But still he fell, down and down, into the inky blackness of the canyon below. After what felt like hours, but was likely only a matter of seconds, Javier's descent came to an abrupt and brutal halt. He crashed into a ledge jutting out from the ravine wall, the impact driving what little air remained from his lungs. For several long moments, Javier lay there, teetering on the edge of consciousness. Every breath was agony, and he could feel warm blood trickling from numerous cuts and gashes. But he was alive. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived the fall. As his senses slowly returned, Javier became aware of his surroundings. The ledge he had landed on was narrow, barely wide enough for him to lie flat. On one side, the ravine wall rose up into the darkness. On the other, there was nothing but empty space and the promise of a much longer fall. Javier tried to move, to push himself into a sitting position, but his body refused to cooperate. Sharp pains lanced through his chest with every breath, suggesting broken ribs. His left arm, the one that had been hanging oddly, was definitely broken, and his right ankle, already sprained from his earlier fall from the horse, was now swollen to twice its normal size. As he lay there, taking stock of his injuries, a new sound reached his ears. It was the sound of water, faint but unmistakable. Somewhere below him, at the bottom of the ravine, a river or stream flowed. The realization brought with it a glimmer of hope. Where there was water, there was life. If he could somehow make it down to the water, he might be able to follow it out of the canyon and back to civilization. But first, he had to survive the night. Javier forced himself to focus, to push past the pain and fear. He needed to assess his situation and figure out a plan. The creature that had been pursuing him was still out there somewhere. Had it given up when Javier jumped into the ravine? Or was it even now finding a way down, determined to finish what it had started? The thought sent a shiver of terror through him. Javier strained his ears, listening for any sign of pursuit. But all he could hear was the faint sound of rushing water and his own labored breathing. As the adrenaline of his fall began to wear off, the full extent of Javier's predicament became clear. He was badly injured, trapped on a narrow ledge in a deep ravine, with no supplies and no way to call for help. The night was growing colder, and he could feel the chill seeping into his battered body. Hypothermia, Javier realized, was now as much of a threat as the creature that had chased him. He needed to find a way to keep warm and to stop the bleeding from his numerous wounds. With agonizing slowness, Javier began to explore the ledge with his one good hand. He felt around in the darkness, hoping to find something, anything, that might help him survive the night. His fingers brushed against something soft. Moss, he realized. The ledge was covered in a thick layer of moss. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. With painstaking effort, Javier began to gather the moss, piling it around himself as best he could with his one functioning arm. The process was slow and agonizing. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his battered body. But Javier persevered, driven by the primal urge to survive. As he worked, he tried to focus on the practical aspects of his situation, pushing the terror of what had happened to the back of his mind. By the time he had gathered all the moss he could reach, Javier was exhausted. He lay back, his makeshift insulation providing a small measure of warmth and comfort. But as he stared up into the darkness, the events of the night came rushing back. What was that thing that had chased him? How had it known his name? The questions swirled in his mind, each more terrifying than the last. Javier had lived in these mountains his whole life, had heard all the legends and folklore. But he had always dismissed them as superstition. Now he wasn't so sure. As the night wore on, Javier drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain from his injuries, the cold, and the constant fear of what might be lurking in the darkness above kept him from finding any real rest. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy form of his pursuer. heard that raspy voice calling his name. At some point during the long night, Javier became aware of a change in the air. A faint breeze carried with it the scent of snow. He opened his eyes to see small white flakes drifting down into the ravine. The sight filled him with a new kind of dread. Snow meant colder temperatures, increased risk of hypothermia. It also meant that any tracks or trail he might have left would soon be covered, making it even harder for anyone to find him. As the snowfall increased, Javier made a desperate decision. He couldn't stay on this ledge. He had to try to make his way down to the water he could hear below. It was risky. In his condition, any further falls could be fatal. But staying put was a sure death sentence. With gritted teeth, Javier began to move. He used his good arm to drag himself to the edge of the ledge, peering down into the darkness below. The faint pre-dawn light revealed a steep, rocky slope leading down to what looked like a narrow canyon floor. Taking a deep breath, Javier began his descent. He moved inch by agonizing inch, using his one good arm and leg to lower himself down the slope. The loose rocks and now snow-slicked surface made every movement treacherous. Several times, Javier nearly lost his grip, his heart racing as he scrabbled for purchase on the unforgiving terrain. The pain in his broken arm and ribs was almost unbearable, but he pushed through it, focusing on each small movement, each incremental bit of progress. As he neared the bottom of the slope, Javier's strength began to fail him. His vision blurred, and his movements became sluggish. He was so close to the canyon floor, to the water he had heard, but his body was giving out. With one final, desperate effort, Javier let himself slide the last few feet. He hit the ground hard, the impact sending fresh waves of agony through his already battered form. For several long moments, he lay there, teetering on the edge of consciousness. The sound of running water roused him. Javier opened his eyes to find himself mere yards from a swift-flowing stream. The sight of the water gave him a surge of renewed energy. Water meant life, meant a chance at survival. Summoning the last of his strength, Javier dragged himself to the water's edge. The icy liquid shocked his system as he plunged his hand into the stream, bringing handfuls to his parched lips. The water was clean and fresh, and Javier drank deeply, feeling life flowing back into his battered body. As he drank, Javier became aware of his surroundings. The canyon was narrow, with steep walls rising on either side. The stream flowed swiftly, carving its way through the rocky terrain. And there, just upstream, Javier saw something that made his heart leap, a small cave in the canyon wall. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Somewhere he could rest, recuperate, and try to figure out his next move. With renewed determination, Javier began to drag himself towards the cave opening. The journey of a few dozen yards felt like miles. Every movement was agony, every inch gained a battle against his own failing body. But Javier pressed on, driven by the need to reach safety before his strength gave out completely. Finally, after what felt like hours, Javier reached the cave entrance. It was shallow, more of an overhang really, but it was enough to provide some shelter from the elements. He pulled himself inside, collapsing onto the rough stone floor. As exhaustion overtook him, Javier's last conscious thought was of the creature that had chased him. Was it still out there, searching for him, or had he managed to escape its clutches? With these unanswered questions swirling in his mind, Javier finally succumbed to unconsciousness, his battered body giving in to the demands for rest. But even in sleep, his face was etched with lines of pain and fear, a testament to the ordeal he had endured and the challenges that still lay ahead. When Javier finally regained consciousness, the world around him had changed. The dim light filtering into the cave told him it was daytime, though how long he had been unconscious he couldn't say. His body felt like one massive bruise, every movement sending waves of pain through him. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, Javier took stock of his surroundings. The cave was small, barely large enough for him to lie down fully. The walls were rough, uneven stone, with no signs of human habitation. It was a purely natural formation, a random quirk of geology that had provided him with much-needed shelter. Javier's mind raced as he tried to piece together the events that had led him here. The ride home, the voice in the woods, the terrifying chase, and the desperate leap into the ravine. It all seemed like a nightmare. But the pain in his body and the unfamiliar surroundings were stark reminders that it had all been terrifyingly real. He attempted to sit up, gritting his teeth against the agony that lanced through his ribs and arm. The movement sent a wave of dizziness washing over him, and for a moment, Javier thought he might pass out again. But he fought against the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision, forcing himself to stay conscious. Once the world stopped spinning, Javier began a careful assessment of his injuries. His left arm was definitely broken, swollen, and discolored. At least one rib, possibly more, was cracked or broken, making each breath a painful ordeal. His right ankle, already sprained from his fall from the horse, was now swollen to twice its normal size. Cuts and bruises covered almost every inch of his exposed skin. The gravity of his situation began to sink in. He was severely injured, alone in an unfamiliar part of the mountains, with no supplies and no way to call for help. And somewhere out there, potentially still hunting for him, was a creature that defied explanation. Javier closed his eyes, fighting back a wave of despair. He had always prided himself on his toughness, on his ability to handle whatever life threw at him. But this was beyond anything he had ever faced before. As he sat there trying to gather his thoughts and formulate a plan, a sound from outside the cave made him freeze. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rush of the nearby stream. But it grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Something was approaching the cave. Panic surged through Javier. Had the creature found him? Was this to be the end of his ordeal, cornered and helpless in this small cave? He looked around frantically for something, anything he could use as a weapon. But there was nothing within reach, just bare stone and a few loose pebbles. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by a low, rumbling sound that might have been breathing or growling. Javier pressed himself against the back wall of the cave, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it would burst from his chest. A shadow fell across the cave entrance. Javier held his breath. Every muscle in his body tensed despite the pain. This was it. Whatever had chased him through the forest, whatever had known his name and hunted him with such terrifying persistence, was about to reveal itself. But what appeared in the cave entrance wasn't the monstrous shape Javier had been expecting. It was a bear. A large brown bear that filled the entire opening with its bulk. For a moment, Javier's terror gave way to confusion. A bear? Had it all been just a bear? But no, he knew that wasn't possible. The thing that had chased him, that had thrown him through the air with impossible strength, had been something else entirely. The bear sniffed the air, its nose twitching as it caught Javier's scent. It let out a low growl, taking a step into the cave. Javier pressed himself even harder against the back wall, his mind racing. He had encountered bears before in his years in the mountains, knew that they generally avoided humans unless provoked or protecting their young. But in his current state, injured and trapped, Javier knew he stood no chance against the powerful animal. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable attack. It never came. Instead, a new sound filled the air. A high-pitched, inhuman shriek that seemed to shake the very walls of the cave. Javier's eyes snapped open to see the bear rearing up on its hind legs, roaring in what could only be described as terror. And there, just visible beyond the bear's massive form, was a shadow. A shape that seemed to shift and change even as Javier looked at it. It was the creature from the forest, the thing that had chased him. The bear, faced with this unnatural presence, made a decision. It turned and fled, its bulk surprisingly quick as it lumbered away from the cave and down the canyon. Javier watched in horror as the shadow at the cave entrance seemed to grow, stretching and expanding until it blotted out all light. That rasping voice, the one that had called his name in the forest, spoke again. "Did you think you could escape me, Javier?" it said, the words dripping with malevolent glee. "Did you think a simple fall would save you from your fate?" Javier wanted to close his eyes, to shut out the terror that stood before him. But he couldn't. He was transfixed, unable to look away from the nightmare made real. The shadow began to coalesce, taking on a more solid form. What Javier saw made his blood run cold. It was as if every fear, every nightmare he had ever had been given physical form. The creature was massive, towering over him even in the confines of the small cave. Its body seemed to be made of shifting darkness, with limbs that ended in wickedly sharp claws. But it was the face that truly terrified Javier, or rather the lack of a face. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of shadow. Yet somehow, Javier knew it was looking directly at him, seeing into the very depths of his soul. What are you?" Javier managed to croak out, his voice barely more than a whisper. The creature's non-existent mouth seemed to stretch into a grin, revealing rows of gleaming teeth that hadn't been there a moment before. "I am your reckoning, Javier," it said. "I am the price you pay for a life lived without consequence, for the pain you've inflicted on others, for the promises you've broken." Javier's mind reeled. What was it talking about? Yes, he had made mistakes in his life, had done things he wasn't proud of. But surely nothing to deserve this. As if reading his thoughts, the creature laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Oh, Javier," it said. "Do you truly not understand? Do you not remember the lives you've ruined, the hearts you've broken, the trust you've betrayed?" And suddenly, Javier did remember. Memories he had long suppressed came flooding back. The friend he had betrayed for personal gain, the lover he had abandoned when things got difficult, the countless promises he had made and broken without a second thought. "No," Javier whispered, tears forming in his eyes. "No, I didn't mean..." "Intentions mean nothing," the creature snarled. "Actions are what matter, and your actions, Javier, have led you here, to me." The creature began to advance, its form seeming to grow larger with each step. Javier pressed himself against the cave wall, knowing there was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. As the shadow fell over him, blotting out what little light remained, Javier closed his eyes. In that moment, facing what he was sure would be his end, he made a promise, not to any god or higher power, but to himself. If he survived this, if by some miracle he made it out alive, he would change, he would make amends for his past mistakes, would live a life worthy of this second chance. And then the darkness engulfed him, and Javier knew no more. The first thing Javier became aware of was pain. It radiated through every part of his body, a constant, throbbing reminder of all he had endured. The second thing he noticed was light, warm, golden sunlight streaming across his face. Slowly, cautiously, Javier opened his eyes. He found himself lying on his back, staring up at a clear blue sky. The sun was high overhead, suggesting it was around midday. But how was this possible? The last thing he remembered was being in the cave, confronted by that terrifying shadow creature. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by his injuries and the trauma of his fall? But no, the pain in his body was too real, too intense to be imagined. With great effort, Javier managed to push himself into a sitting position. He looked around, trying to get his bearings. He was no longer in the cave or even in the canyon. Instead, he found himself in a small clearing in the forest. Trees surrounded him on all sides, their leaves rustling gently in a warm breeze. Confusion and fear warred within him. How had he gotten here? What had happened in the cave? And most importantly, where was the creature that had pursued him? As Javier's eyes scanned his surroundings, they fell upon something that made his heart skip a beat. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood Luna, his horse. She was calmly grazing on the lush grass, seeming completely unperturbed by the events of the night before. Javier blinked hard, sure he must be seeing things. But no, Luna was really there. Somehow, against all odds, she had found him. Or had he found her? The details of how he had ended up in this clearing were frustratingly out of reach, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. With painstaking slowness, Javier began to take stock of his condition. To his amazement, while he was still in considerable pain, his injuries seemed less severe than he remembered. His left arm, which he was sure had been broken, was bruised and sore but functional. His ribs ached with every breath, but the sharp, stabbing pain of broken bones was gone. Even more surprisingly, the numerous cuts and gashes he had sustained during his tumble down the ravine seemed to have partially healed. They were still visible, angry red lines across his skin, but they were no longer bleeding and seemed to be well on their way to healing. None of this made sense. Javier knew he should be in much worse shape. The fall alone should have killed him, or at the very least left him with injuries that would take weeks or months to heal. And yet, here he was, battered and bruised but very much alive and on the mend. As Javier struggled to make sense of his situation, a memory surfaced, the promise he had made in what he thought were his final moments. He had vowed to change, to make amends for his past mistakes if given the chance. Was this that chance? Had something, be it God, fate, or some force beyond his understanding, decided to grant him that opportunity? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Javier had lived most of his life without much regard for consequences, doing what he wanted when he wanted. The idea of taking responsibility, of actively working to right his wrongs, was daunting. But as he sat there in the clearing, the warm sun on his face, and the gentle breeze rustling through the trees, Javier felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Hope for a better future. Hope that it wasn't too late to change. With renewed determination, Javier began the painful process of getting to his feet. His body protested every movement, but he pushed through the pain, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. Once standing, Javier took a moment to steady himself. The world swam around him, and for a brief moment he thought he might collapse. But he gritted his teeth and remained upright, taking slow, deep breaths until the dizziness passed. Luna, hearing his movements, lifted her head and turned towards him. Their eyes met, and Javier felt a surge of emotion. This loyal animal had somehow found her way back to him, defying all odds. He limped towards her, murmuring soft words of comfort and gratitude. As he approached, Luna remained still, as if sensing his fragile state. Javier reached out with his good arm, gently stroking her neck. The familiar feel of her coat under his hand grounded him, providing a much-needed connection to the normal world after the surreal horrors he had experienced. "What do you say, old girl?" Javier whispered, his voice hoarse. "Ready to go home?" Luna nickered softly in response, and Javier took it as agreement. With painstaking slowness, he began to prepare for the journey. Every movement was a challenge, his battered body protesting each time he reached for something or shifted his weight. Mounting Luna proved to be a formidable task. In his current state, Javier lacked the strength to pull himself up as he normally would. After several failed attempts, each ending in a fresh wave of pain, he managed to use a nearby fallen log as a makeshift mounting block. Finally seated in the saddle, Javier took a moment to orient himself. The clearing was unfamiliar, but he could see the peaks of familiar mountains in the distance. Using these as reference points, he was able to determine the general direction of home. As Luna began to move, picking her way carefully through the forest at a gentle walk, Javier's mind turned once again to the events of the night before. The terrifying chase through the woods, the leap into the ravine, the confrontation in the cave. It all seemed like a distant nightmare now, made hazy by the warm sunlight filtering through the trees. But Javier knew it had been real. The aches in his body, the tears in his clothing, and most of all the profound sense of change within himself all testified to the truth of his experience. Whatever had happened, whatever force or entity he had encountered, it had shaken him to his core. As Luna carried him through the forest, Javier found himself reflecting on his life. He thought of the people he had wronged, the promises he had broken, the selfish choices he had made. Each memory was like a physical blow, bringing with it a deep sense of shame and regret. But along with these painful recollections came a growing resolve. Javier made silent promises to himself, vowing to make amends where he could, to be a better man, a better father, a better member of his community. The creature in the cave had called itself his reckoning, but Javier now saw it as something else, a wake-up call, a chance for redemption. The journey home was long and arduous. Every step Luna took sent jolts of pain through Javier's battered body. The sun climbed high in the sky and then began its descent, the forest shadows lengthening as afternoon turned to evening. As they traveled, Javier remained alert, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. Part of him expected at any moment to hear that rasping voice again, to see a shadow detach itself from the trees and come for him. But the forest remained peaceful, filled only with the natural sounds of birds and wind in the leaves. It was well past sunset when Javier finally saw the lights of his village in the distance. The sight filled him with an overwhelming sense of relief. He was home. He had survived. As they approached the outskirts of the village, Javier could see a commotion. People were gathered, some holding lanterns, others on horseback. It took him a moment to realize what he was seeing. A search party. They had been looking for him. When the first person spotted him, a shout went up. Suddenly, Javier found himself surrounded by friends and neighbors, their faces a mix of relief, concern, and amazement. Questions came at him from all sides. Where had he been? What had happened? Was he all right? Javier opened his mouth to respond, but found he didn't know what to say. How could he explain what had happened? Who would believe him? In the end, he simply said, "I got lost, fell from my horse, but I'm home now." As hands reached up to help him down from Luna, Javier caught sight of his family pushing through the crowd. His wife, Mariana, her face streaked with tears of relief. His children, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and joy at seeing their father in such a state. In that moment, looking at the faces of his loved ones, Javier felt the full weight of his experience crash down upon him. He had come so close to losing all of this, to never seeing his family again. The thought brought tears to his eyes. As he was helped towards his home, supported on either side by friends, Javier made a silent vow. He would never take this for granted again. He would be the man his family deserved, the man he should have been all along. The creature in the cave had offered him a choice, to face his reckoning or to change. Javier had chosen change, and now, surrounded by the love and concern of his community, he knew he had made the right choice. As he crossed the threshold of his home, Javier felt as if he were entering a new chapter of his life. The horrors of the past night were behind him, but their lesson would stay with him forever. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. The days following Javier's return were a blur of rest, recovery, and reflection. His injuries, while less severe than they should have been given his ordeal, still required time to heal. The village doctor, Don Alejandro, visited daily, marveling at Javier's rapid recovery while cautioning him against overexertion. Javier spent most of his time in bed, his body demanding rest to mend the damage it had sustained. But while his physical form recuperated, his mind was far from idle. The events in the forest and the cave played on repeat in his thoughts. each recollection bringing with it a mix of terror and profound realization. Mariana, his wife, was a constant presence at his bedside. Her eyes, which had been filled with tears of joy upon his return, now often held a questioning look. She knew her husband well enough to sense that something fundamental had changed in him, but she didn't press for details. Instead, she offered silent support, her hand often finding his as if to reassure herself that he was really there. As the days passed and Javier regained his strength, he found himself grappling with how to move forward. The vows he had made in the forest, the promises to change and make amends, weighed heavily on him. But where to start? How does one begin to rectify a lifetime of selfish choices and broken promises? It was on the 5th day after his return that Javier made his first move towards redemption. He asked Mariana to bring their children to his room. When they entered, their faces a mix of excitement at seeing their father and apprehension at his still battered appearance. Javier felt his heart constrict with love and regret. "Come here, mis amores," he said, gesturing for them to sit on the bed. As they settled around him, Javier took a deep breath. "I owe you all an apology," he began. Over the next hour, Javier spoke to his family with a candor he had never before displayed. He apologized for his frequent absences, for the times he had chosen the cantina over family dinners, for the promises he had made and broken. He spoke of his desire to be a better father and husband, asking for their forgiveness and their help in holding him accountable. There were tears. From Javier, from Mariana, from the children. But by the end of the conversation, there was also a sense of hope, of a new beginning for their family. This conversation was just the first step. Over the following weeks, as Javier's strength returned, he set about making amends in the wider community. He visited Miguel, the friend he had betrayed years ago for financial gain, and offered a heartfelt apology, along with a promise to make things right. He sought out those he had wronged, one by one, facing their anger or disappointment with humility and a genuine desire for forgiveness. Not everyone was receptive to Javier's attempts at reconciliation. Some turned him away, the wounds he had inflicted still too raw. Others listened but reserved judgment, wary of empty promises. Javier accepted these reactions with grace, understanding that trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. As he worked to mend the relationships he had damaged, Javier also began to make changes in his daily life. He swore off alcohol, much to the surprise of his former drinking companions. He became more involved in community affairs, offering his help where it was needed, and working to be a positive force in the village. Perhaps the most significant change, however, was in Javier's relationship with the mountains that surrounded their home. Where once he had viewed the wilderness as something to be conquered or exploited, he now approached it with a sense of respect, and even reverence. He began taking his children on short hikes, teaching them about the plants and animals they encountered. He shared stories of the mountain's history and the legends associated with them, but he never spoke of his own terrifying encounter. That experience remained locked away in his heart, a secret burden he carried alone. As the weeks turned into months, the physical scars of Javier's ordeal faded, but the mental and emotional impact remained, shaping his actions and decisions every day. He was not a perfect man. Old habits and impulses still surfaced at times. But now, when faced with a choice, Javier would pause and remember the shadowy creature in the cave, the reckoning he had faced, and the second chance he had been given. 1 year to the day after his fateful encounter in the forest, Javier rode Luna up to the edge of the woods. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, he dismounted and stood facing the trees. The forest was quiet, peaceful, showing no sign of the terrors he had experienced there. Javier closed his eyes, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves. For a moment, he thought he heard a whisper on the breeze, a faint echo of that rasping voice that had called his name. But when he opened his eyes, there was nothing but the gently swaying trees. As he turned to Mount Luna and head home, Javier felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had faced his reckoning and emerged changed. The creature, whatever it had been, had forced him to confront the darkest parts of himself, to acknowledge the pain he had caused others. In doing so, it had set him on a path towards redemption. Javier knew that his journey was far from over. Redemption was not a destination, but a lifelong process. But as he rode home to his family, to the life he was working hard to improve, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine happiness. The terror in Sierra Madre had changed Javier forever. But in facing that terror, in confronting the shadows within himself, he had found a way towards the light. And for that, despite the nightmares that still occasionally plagued him, he was grateful. Years passed, and the story of Javier's transformation became something of a legend in the village. People spoke in hushed tones about the night he had disappeared and the changed man who had returned. Some attributed the shift to a near-death experience, others to divine intervention. Only Javier knew the full truth, and he kept that knowledge close to his heart. As I, his youngest daughter, grew older, I began to notice the way people looked at my father. There was respect in their eyes, yes, but also a kind of wonder, as if they couldn't quite believe the man he had become. It was different from the fear-tinged respect he had commanded in his younger days. This was something deeper, more genuine. I was too young to remember the old Javier that people sometimes referenced. The father I knew was a kind, patient man who always had time for his family. He was deeply involved in community life, often the first to offer help when someone was in need. And he had an almost reverent attitude towards the natural world, especially the mountains that surrounded our home. It wasn't until I was in my teens that I first heard the full story of what had happened that night in the forest. Javier had always been reluctant to discuss it, deflecting questions with vague references to getting lost and having a change of heart. But one night, as we sat around the fire during a family camping trip, he finally opened up. I remember the way the firelight flickered across his face as he spoke, casting deep shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of his words. He told us of the terrifying chase through the woods, of the leap into the ravine that should have killed him, of the confrontation in the cave with a creature that seemed to embody all his past sins. As he spoke, I saw my mother reach out and take his hand, offering silent support. My siblings and I listened in rapt attention, scarcely daring to breathe lest we break the spell of his narrative. When he finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a nightbird. I looked at my father with new eyes, seeing not just the man I had always known, but the man he had been, and the incredible journey he had undertaken. "Why tell us now?" my older brother finally asked. Javier was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on the dancing flames. "Because it's important that you understand," he said at last. "Not just what happened, but why it happened. The choices we make, the way we treat others, these things have consequences. Sometimes those consequences catch up to us in ways we could never expect." He looked up then, his gaze moving from one of us to the next. "I was given a second chance," he said softly. "Not everyone gets that. I want you to learn from my mistakes, to understand the importance of living with integrity, of treating others with kindness and respect." That night marked a turning point in our family. The story of Javier's encounter in the forest became a kind of parable, a cautionary tale that reminded us of the importance of ethical living and the possibility of redemption. As I grew older and began to make my own way in the world, I often found myself reflecting on my father's experience. In moments of temptation or moral ambiguity, I would remember the terror in his eyes as he described the creature in the cave, and I would find the strength to make the right choice. Javier lived to see his grandchildren, and to them, he was simply abuelo, the kind old man with twinkling eyes and endless patience. They loved to sit at his feet and listen to his stories of the mountains, though he never shared with them the tale of his fateful night in the forest. That story remained a family secret, passed down only when we felt our children were old enough to understand its true significance. In his later years, Javier's health began to fail, but his spirit remained strong. Even confined to his bed, he continued to be a source of wisdom and guidance for our family and the wider community. People would come to sit by his bedside, seeking advice or simply to bask in the calm, reassuring presence he had become. As his time grew short, Javier called each of us to his side individually. When my turn came, I sat next to him, holding his weathered hand in mine. His eyes, though dimmed with age, still held that spark of vitality that had defined him since that fateful night so many years ago. "Mihija," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to promise me something." I leaned in closer, eager to hear his words. "Anything, Papa," I replied. He squeezed my hand weakly. "Promise me that you'll remember the lesson of my story. Not just the words, but the meaning behind them. Life is precious, mi amor. Every day is a gift, a chance to do better, to be better." Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. "I promise, Papa. I'll never forget." He smiled then, a smile that seemed to light up the room. "Good," he said, "and promise me one more thing. Promise that you'll tell the story, not just to your children, but to anyone who needs to hear it. Our experiences, our mistakes, our triumphs, they all have value if we can learn from them." "I promise," I said again, my voice choked with emotion. Javier passed away peacefully in his sleep a few days later. The entire village mourned his loss, and the stories people shared at his wake painted a picture of a man who had truly lived two lives: the selfish, reckless man of his youth, and the kind, wise elder he had become. In the years that followed, I kept my promises to my father. I strove to live each day with purpose and kindness, always mindful of the second chance he had been given and determined to make the most of my own life. And I shared his story, passing it down to my own children and grandchildren. But I didn't stop there. Inspired by my father's transformation and the power of his experience, I began to write. At first, it was just for myself, a way to process my grief and honor my father's memory. But as time went on, I realized that this story had the potential to touch lives far beyond our small village. I wrote of the terror in Sierra Madre, of the creature in the cave that was both monster and savior. I wrote of my father's journey from selfishness to redemption, of the ripple effect his transformation had on our family and our community. And I wrote of the lessons he had learned and passed on to us. The importance of integrity, of kindness, of never taking our loved ones or our own lives for granted. As I wrote, I came to understand my father's experience in a new light. The terror he had faced in the forest was real, yes, but it was also deeply personal. The creature that had confronted him was a manifestation of his own guilt and regret, a physical representation of the reckoning he had long avoided but desperately needed. In facing this terror, in confronting the darkest parts of himself, my father had found a path to redemption. It wasn't an easy path, true change never is. But it was one he walked with determination and grace for the rest of his life. Now, as I share this story with you, I do so in the hope that it will have the same impact on you that it had on me and so many others. Perhaps you won't face a terrifying creature in a dark cave, but we all have our own reckonings to face, our own chances for redemption. The legacy of Javier's night of terror in Sierra Madre lives on through this tale. It's a reminder that it's never too late to change, to make amends, to become the person we're meant to be. It's a call to live with integrity and kindness, to value our relationships and the precious gift of each day. As you go forward from this story, I urge you to take its lessons to heart. Look at your own life with honest eyes. Are there amends you need to make? Changes you've been avoiding? Don't wait for a terrifying encounter in the woods to spark your transformation. Let my father's story be your wake-up call. Remember, every day is a second chance. Every day is a chance to Every moment is an opportunity to choose kindness, to act with integrity, to live in a way that honors the gift of life. This is the true legacy of the terror in Sierra Madre, not fear, but hope. Hope for redemption, for transformation, for a life lived with purpose and love. And so, as I conclude this tale, I pass the torch to you. What will you do with this story? How will it change your life? The choice, as it was for my father in that cave so many years ago, is yours. May you choose wisely, and may your own story be one of growth, redemption, and the triumph of the human spirit over the darkness within and without. For in the end, that is the most terrifying and beautiful truth of all, that we have the power to change, to grow, to become more than we ever thought possible. This is the lesson of Sierra Madre. This is the legacy of Javier. And now it becomes a part of your story, too. What will you write with it? I've always been the worrier in my family, especially when it comes to my younger siblings. Perhaps it's the burden of being the eldest, or maybe it's just my nature. But nothing could have prepared me for the story my youngest sister Isabel shared with me after her hiking trip in Colorado 2 years ago. It was a tale that would haunt me for months to come, a stark reminder of nature's unforgiving power and the thin line between adventure and disaster. Isabel had always been the free spirit among us, her early 20s fueling a desire for exploration and new experiences. When she told me about her plans to go hiking in the Colorado mountains with her friend Mia, I felt the familiar twinge of concern. But I pushed it aside, reminding myself that she was an adult now, capable of making her own decisions. "It'll be fine," Isabel had assured me over the phone, her voice brimming with excitement. "We're just going to hike up the mountain, camp overnight, and finish the hike in the morning. Easy peasy." I remember forcing a smile, even though she couldn't see it. "Just be careful, okay? Mountains can be unpredictable." "Don't worry so much, we've got this." She laughed, and I could almost see her carefree grin. Little did either of us know then how those words would come back to haunt us. The Colorado mountains held secrets and dangers that neither Isabel nor her friend were prepared for. What was meant to be a simple hiking trip would turn into a nightmare scenario, a brush with death that would leave an indelible mark on all involved. As I recount this story, I ask you to remember that what follows is not a work of fiction. This is a true account of events that transpired in the unforgiving wilderness of Colorado. It's a tale of survival, of human resilience, and of the unexpected horrors that can lurk in even the most beautiful of settings. The mountains have always held a certain allure for people like Isabel. They stand as silent sentinels, their peaks shrouded in mystery, promising adventure and breathtaking vistas to those brave enough to scale their heights. But they also hide dangers. Sudden weather changes, treacherous terrain, and the ever-present risk of getting lost or injured far from help. As Isabel and Mia set out on their hike that fateful day, they were blissfully unaware of the ordeal that awaited them. They saw only the beauty of the landscape, the thrill of the climb ahead. The clear blue sky and warm sun gave no hint of the drastic change in weather that was to come. I often wonder if they had known what lay ahead. Would they have turned back? Would they have prepared differently? Or would the allure of the mountains still have drawn them upward, into an adventure that would test their limits and change their lives forever? These are questions without answers, musings that serve only to underscore the unpredictable nature of life and the wilderness. What I do know is this: the events that unfolded on that mountain would reveal not only the terrifying power of nature, but also the incredible strength of the human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. As I delve into the details of Isabel's harrowing experience, I invite you to put yourself in her shoes. Imagine the excitement of setting out on a new adventure, the gradual shift from enthusiasm to concern as things begin to go wrong, and finally, the gut-wrenching fear of facing a life-or-death situation in an unforgiving environment. This is not just Isabel's story. It's a story about all of us, our vulnerabilities, our resilience, and our capacity for compassion even in the most dire circumstances. It's a reminder of the respect we must have for nature and the importance of preparation when venturing into the wilderness. So let us begin this journey together, tracing the footsteps of Isabel and Mia as they ascended into the Colorado mountains, unaware of the terror and triumph that awaited them. The morning of the hike dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that seems to promise nothing but good things. Isabel later told me how she and Mia had stood at the base of the trail, looking up at the mountain with a mixture of excitement and awe. It was so beautiful, Isabel recalled, her eyes distant with the memory. The sky was this incredible shade of blue, and the mountain, it just seemed to go on forever. We were so excited to get started. They had arrived at the trailhead early, the sun barely cresting the horizon. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. It was the kind of morning that makes you glad to be alive, that fills you with a sense of possibility and adventure. Isabel and Mia checked their backpacks one last time. Water, snacks, first aid kit, extra layers of clothing. They had packed light, planning to make it to their midway camping point by nightfall. Looking back, I can't help but wish they had packed more, had been more prepared for the worst. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. As they set off up the trail, Isabel couldn't help but notice Mia's footwear. I remember looking down and seeing Mia's Chaco sandals, she told me later. I thought it was a bit odd for hiking, but Mia said they were super comfortable and that she hiked in them all the time. I didn't think much of it then. Those sandals would later prove to be a critical mistake. But at that moment, neither of them could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The trail wound its way up the mountain, sometimes steep, sometimes leveling out to offer breathtaking views of the valley below. Isabel and Mia chatted as they walked, pausing occasionally to take photos or simply to catch their breath and admire the scenery. It was during one of these breaks that we first noticed the clouds, Isabel recounted. They were just little wisps at first, nothing to worry about. But they seemed to be moving in fast. Despite the encroaching clouds, the two friends pressed on. They were making good time and were confident they would reach their planned camping spot well before nightfall. As they climbed higher, the vegetation began to thin, giving way to rockier terrain. The air grew cooler, and Isabel found herself zipping up her jacket. It was mid-afternoon when they reached a particularly challenging section of the trail. The path narrowed, hugging the side of the mountain with a steep drop-off to one side. Isabel remembered feeling a flutter of anxiety as they navigated this section, the wind picking up and tugging at their clothes. I remember looking down and feeling a bit dizzy, she told me. The drop was... It was terrifying, and the wind didn't help. For the first time, I started to wonder if we were in over our heads. But they pressed on, carefully picking their way along the narrow path. By the time they reached wider, more stable ground, both Isabel and Mia were visibly shaken. They paused for a moment, catching their breath and sharing a nervous laugh at the challenge they had just overcome. It was at this point that Mia first mentioned her feet. "My sandals are rubbing a bit," she said, examining a red spot on her heel. "I hope they don't give me blisters." Isabel offered some moleskin from the first aid kit, but it was clear that Mia's inappropriate footwear was starting to become an issue. Still, they were more than halfway to their planned camping spot. Turning back didn't seem like an option. As the afternoon wore on, the weather continued to deteriorate. The wisps of cloud had coalesced into a solid gray mass overhead, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze at the start of their hike, was now gusting strongly, carrying with it the first few drops of rain. "We need to pick up the pace," Isabel said, eyeing the sky warily. "I think we're in for some weather." Mia nodded, adjusting her backpack. "Yeah, let's go. My feet are killing me, but I just want to get to the campsite now." They pressed on, their earlier chatter replaced by determined silence. The trail grew steeper, more challenging, and Isabel found herself constantly checking on Mia, who was clearly struggling with her inadequate footwear. As they rounded a bend in the trail, the wind suddenly picked up, driving stinging rain into their faces. In a matter of minutes, they were soaked to the skin, the temperature plummeting as the storm hit in earnest. "We need to find shelter," Isabel shouted over the howling wind. "This is getting dangerous." Mia nodded, her face pale with cold and fear. They hurried along the trail, eyes scanning desperately for any kind of protection from the elements. The rain was coming down in sheets now, reducing visibility to mere feet. It was in this moment, as they huddled together against the fury of the storm, that Isabel realized just how unprepared they were for this situation. The beautiful day that had promised so much had turned into a nightmare, and they were trapped on the side of a mountain with night falling and a storm raging around them. The true test of their endurance and survival was just beginning, and as the darkness closed in, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that something even more terrifying awaited them on this mountain. As the storm raged around them, Isabel and Mia stumbled through the increasingly treacherous terrain, desperately seeking shelter. The rain had turned the trail into a slippery mess, and every step was a battle against the howling wind and near-zero visibility. "I've never been so scared in my life," Isabel later confessed to me, her voice trembling at the memory. "It was like the mountain itself was trying to throw us off. We could barely see where we were going, and every gust of wind felt like it might sweep us away." Their clothes, soaked through, clung to their bodies like icy shrouds. Mia's sandals, wholly inadequate for these conditions, offered no protection against the cold and wet. Isabel could see her friend's feet were already showing signs of the beginnings of frostbite, the skin an angry red where it wasn't deathly pale. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Isabel's foot slipped on a wet rock. She felt herself falling, a scream torn from her throat as she slid towards the edge of the path. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought this was it. She was going over the edge, plummeting to her death in the storm-shrouded valley below. But Mia's hand shot out, grabbing Isabel's arm in a vice-like grip. With a strength born of desperation, Mia hauled her friend back from the brink. They collapsed together on the muddy trail, gasping for breath, the realization of how close they'd come to disaster washing over them. "We can't stay out here," Mia shouted over the wind, her voice cracking with fear and cold. "We're going to die if we don't find shelter soon." Isabel nodded, struggling to her feet. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely zip up her jacket. "Look," she cried suddenly, pointing ahead. "I think I see something." Through the curtain of rain, a dark shape loomed. As they stumbled closer, they realized it was a large outcropping of rock, creating a small overhang. It wasn't much, but it was the best shelter they'd seen since the storm hit. They huddled under the overhang, pressing themselves against the cold stone. It offered some protection from the wind and rain, but did little to warm them. As night fell, the temperature continued to drop, and Isabel realized with growing horror that they were in real danger of hypothermia. "We need to get warm," she said, her teeth chattering. "We need to share body heat." They pressed close together, trying to conserve what little warmth they had left. Isabel rummaged in her backpack, pulling out an emergency blanket, a thin sheet of metallic material designed to reflect body heat. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they huddled together under the meager shelter of the emergency blanket, Isabel's mind raced. They were lost, cold, and trapped on the side of a mountain in a raging storm. Their phones had no signal, and even if they did, who could reach them in these conditions? The hours crawled by, each minute an eternity of cold and fear. The storm showed no signs of abating, the wind howling like a living thing, as if the mountain itself was trying to drive them away. In the darkness, every sound became magnified, every shadow a potential threat. Isabel found herself imagining all sorts of horrors lurking just beyond their little sanctuary. What if there were mountain lions or bears drawn by the scent of their fear? What if the rock above them, weakened by the relentless rain, suddenly gave way, crushing them beneath tons of stone? These fears might seem irrational in the light of day, but in the dark, cold night, with exhaustion and hypothermia setting in, they became all too real. Isabel clung to Mia, each of them drawing what comfort they could from the other's presence. As the night wore on, Isabel noticed Mia becoming quieter, her responses slower. "We have to stay awake," Isabel insisted, shaking her friend. "If we fall asleep, we might not wake up." They talked, sharing stories from their lives, making plans for the future, anything to keep their minds active and ward off the creeping lethargy of hypothermia. But as the hours passed, it became harder and harder to focus, to stay alert. Just before dawn, when the night was at its darkest and coldest, Isabel heard something that made her blood run cold. It was a sound that didn't belong, something that stood out from the constant roar of the wind and rain. A scream. Faint, distant, but unmistakably human. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Mia, her heart pounding. Mia stirred sluggishly. "Hear what?" And then it came again, a cry for help, carried on the wind. Someone else was out there, lost and alone in the storm. In that moment, Isabel was faced with a terrible choice. Stay in their meager shelter, preserving what little strength they had left, or venture out into the storm to try and help whoever was out there. As the cry came again, more desperate this time, Isabel knew she couldn't ignore it. Despite the danger, despite their own precarious situation, she couldn't leave another human being to face this nightmare alone. "We have to go," she said, struggling to her feet. "Someone needs our help." Mia looked at her in disbelief. "Are you crazy? We can barely help ourselves." But Isabel was already moving, driven by a determination she didn't know she possessed. "We can't leave them out there. We have to try." And so, as the first faint light of dawn began to penetrate the storm clouds, Isabel and Mia stepped out from their shelter and into the teeth of the storm once more. They were exhausted, cold, and terrified, but they were moving with purpose now. Little did they know that their decision to help would lead them into an even more harrowing situation, one that would test their endurance and humanity to the very limit. The storm had lessened somewhat as Isabel and Mia ventured out from their rocky shelter, but the wind still howled and the rain continued to fall in a steady, cold drizzle. The world around them was a gray blur, the familiar landscape of the mountain transformed into an alien, hostile environment. They paused, straining their ears for any sound that might guide them towards the source of the cries for help. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and their own ragged breathing. "Maybe we imagined it," Mia said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Maybe." And then they heard it again. A faint, desperate cry carried on the wind. "Help! Please help me!" Isabel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The voice sounded weak, filled with a terror that resonated deep within her. Without a word, she began to move in the direction of the sound, Mia following close behind. They picked their way carefully along the treacherous path, every step a battle against the slippery rocks and muddy ground. The trail they had been following the day before was now all but invisible, obscured by the debris brought down by the storm. "Hello!" Isabel called out, her voice snatched away by the wind almost as soon as it left her lips. "We're here to help. Where are you?" They waited, hearts pounding, for any response. For a moment there was nothing but the howling of the wind. Then, faintly, they heard it again. "Here, I'm here." The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere off the trail, up a steep, rocky incline. Isabel and Mia exchanged a glance, both realizing the danger of leaving the relative safety of the path. But there was no question of turning back now. "We're coming!" Isabel shouted, hoping her voice would carry to whoever was out there. "Keep calling out! We'll find you!" They began to climb, their progress painfully slow. The rocks were slick with rain and moss, offering treacherous footing. Mia's sandals, already a liability on the trail, were now downright dangerous. She slipped several times, saved from a bad fall only by Isabel's quick reflexes. As they climbed higher, the wind grew stronger, threatening to tear them from the mountainside. The rain, driven horizontal by the gale, stung their faces and made it difficult to see. But still they pressed on, driven by the increasingly desperate cries for help. "I see something," Mia suddenly shouted, pointing ahead. Through the gloom, they could make out a shape, a person lying motionless on a small ledge above them. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like basic athletic wear, wholly inadequate for the conditions. With renewed energy, Isabel and Mia scrambled up the last few yards. As they reached the ledge, the full horror of the situation became clear. The woman was barely conscious, her skin a mottled blue-white from exposure. Her legs were visibly swollen and discolored, with ugly gashes that spoke of a bad fall. "Oh my God," Mia whispered, her face pale with shock. Isabel knelt beside the woman, trying to assess her condition. "Can you hear me? We're here to help. What's your name?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. Rebecca," she managed to stammer through chattering teeth. "Please, help me." "We're going to get you out of here, Rebecca," Isabel assured her, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "Can you tell us what happened? How long have you been out here?" Rebecca's brow furrowed in confusion. I don't know. A few hours, maybe? I was hiking. I think I fell." Isabel and Mia exchanged worried glances. Given Rebecca's condition, it was clear she had been exposed to the elements for much longer than a few hours. The hypothermia was clearly affecting her memory and judgment. "We need to get her down the mountain," Isabel said to Mia. "She needs medical attention fast." But Rebecca, despite her confused state, seemed to have latched onto one idea. "No," she protested weakly. "My car. It's up the mountain. We need to go up." "Rebecca, listen to me," Isabel said firmly, taking the woman's ice-cold hands in her own. "There's no driving access at the top. Your car isn't up there. We need to get you down to safety." Rebecca shook her head stubbornly, but her eyes were unfocused, her words slurring. "No. Up. Please." It was clear that rational argument wasn't going to work. Rebecca's confused state made her a danger to herself and to her rescuers. Isabel made a quick decision. "Okay, Rebecca," she said soothingly. "We'll help you. But first, we need to warm you up a bit. Can you sit up for me?" With gentle coaxing, they managed to get Rebecca into a sitting position. Isabel unzipped her own jacket, ignoring the bite of the cold wind, and wrapped it around Rebecca's shoulders. Then she and Mia positioned themselves on either side of the injured woman. "On 3, we're going to stand up," Isabel instructed. 1, 2, 3. They lifted Rebecca to her feet, supporting her weight between them. The woman cried out in pain as her injured legs took her weight, nearly collapsing again. But Isabel and Mia held firm, determined not to let her fall. "Okay, Rebecca," Isabel said, her voice calm despite the fear churning in her gut. "We're going to start moving now. Just lean on us. We've got you." And so began one of the most harrowing journeys of Isabel's life. Every step was a battle against the terrain, the weather, and Rebecca's own confused attempts to go in the wrong direction. The wind tore at them, threatening to send them tumbling down the mountainside. The rain had turned to sleet, stinging their faces and making the already treacherous footing even more dangerous. Mia's inadequate footwear made the descent particularly challenging for her. Isabel could see her friend's feet were raw and bleeding, but Mia didn't complain, focusing all her energy on helping Rebecca. They moved achingly slowly. Every yard gained a victory against the mountain and the storm. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes babbling incoherently about her car, other times falling into a silence so profound that Isabel had to keep checking to make sure she was still breathing. As they neared the bottom of the slope, disaster struck. Mia, her feet numb with cold and pain, misstepped on a slippery rock. She went down hard, crying out in pain as her ankle twisted beneath her. The sudden shift in weight nearly sent all three of them tumbling down the mountainside. Isabel managed to keep herself and Rebecca upright, but now they faced a new crisis. Mia couldn't put any weight on her injured ankle. They were still at least an hour from the trailhead, carrying an unconscious woman, and now one of them was injured too. For a moment, Isabel felt despair threatening to overwhelm her. They were cold, injured, exhausted, and still in danger. The mountain seemed determined to claim them, to add them to the grim statistics of hikers who ventured out unprepared and never returned. But as she looked at Mia, gritting her teeth against the pain, and felt Rebecca's faint breathing against her shoulder, Isabel found a well of strength she didn't know she possessed. They had come too far, endured too much to give up now. "We're going to make it," she said, as much to herself as to her companions. "We're going to get off this mountain. All of us." And with that declaration, Isabel adjusted her grip on Rebecca, reached down to help Mia to her feet, and began the final, grueling leg of their descent. The mountain had thrown its worst at them, but they were still standing, still fighting. The true test of their endurance and will to survive was yet to come. The journey down the mountain was a nightmare of pain, exhaustion, and ever-present danger. Isabel's world had narrowed to a series of immediate concerns. Keep moving, don't fall, make sure Rebecca is breathing, check on Mia. Everything else, the cold, her own exhaustion and pain, the fear that gnawed at the edges of her mind, had to be pushed aside. Mia hobbled along on her injured ankle, her face a mask of determination and pain. She couldn't support much of Rebecca's weight anymore, but she refused to let go, stubbornly helping as much as she could. Isabel felt a surge of admiration for her friend's resilience. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness, her moments of lucidity becoming fewer and farther between. When she was awake, she alternated between confusion about their direction and gratitude for their help. "Thank you," she would mumble, her words slurred. "Thank you for finding me." As they descended, the sleet turned back to rain, a constant cold drizzle that seemed to sap what little warmth they had left. The trail, such as it was, had turned into a muddy stream. Each step was treacherous, the ground threatening to slide out from under their feet at any moment. Time lost all meaning. Isabel couldn't have said if they'd been walking for hours or days. The gray light of the overcast sky gave no indication of the time, and her watch had stopped working, its face cracked from a fall earlier in their ordeal. They paused briefly to rest, propping Rebecca against a large boulder. Isabel took the opportunity to check on their supplies. The news wasn't good. They were almost out of water, and what little food they had left was soggy and unappetizing. But they had no choice. They needed to keep their strength up. As Isabel was dividing up the last of their trail mix, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a low rumble, almost felt more than heard, coming from somewhere up the mountain. "Did you hear that?" Mia asked, her eyes wide with fear. Isabel nodded grimly. She knew what that sound meant. The heavy rain, combined with the already saturated ground, had created ideal conditions for landslides. They needed to move, and fast. "We have to go," Isabel said, her voice tight with urgency. "Now." They got Rebecca to her feet, ignoring her confused protests, and started moving as quickly as they dared. The rumbling grew louder, punctuated now by the crack of trees being uprooted and the crash of falling rocks. They had just rounded a bend in the trail when Isabel saw it, a wall of mud, rocks, and broken trees hurtling down the mountainside towards them. It was a sight straight out of her worst nightmares, made all the more terrifying by its very reality. "Run!" she screamed, though running was hardly possible given their condition. They stumbled forward, panic lending them speed they didn't know they still possessed. Rebecca, seeming to sense the danger even in her confused state, tried to help. her feet scrabbling for purchase on the muddy ground. The roar of the landslide was deafening now, drowning out everything else. Isabel could feel the ground shaking beneath her feet. She didn't dare look back, focusing all her energy on moving forward, on getting them to safety. Suddenly, Mia cried out in pain. Her injured ankle had given way, sending her sprawling to the ground. Isabel turned, her heart in her throat, to see her friend lying in the path of the oncoming avalanche of mud and debris. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. Isabel knew she had a choice to make, and less than a second to make it. She could keep going with Rebecca, leaving Mia behind, or she could try to save her friend and risk all their lives. It wasn't really a choice at all. "Hold on to her!" Isabel shouted to Rebecca, transferring the semi-conscious woman's weight fully onto her left side. Then, with her right arm free, she lunged for Mia. Her hand closed around Mia's wrist, just as the leading edge of the landslide reached them. Isabel pulled with all her might, dragging Mia to her feet and forward, away from the deadly flow. They stumbled on, the landslide nipping at their heels. The sound was overwhelming, a roar that seemed to fill the world. Mud splattered their backs, rocks bounced past them, missing by inches. And then, suddenly, they were clear. The landslide continued its destructive path down the mountain, but they were out of its direct path. They collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, unable to believe they had survived. For several long moments they lay there, the rain washing the mud from their faces, their chests heaving as they gulped in air. They were alive. Against all odds, they had cheated death once again. But their ordeal was far from over. They were still on the mountain, still injured and exhausted, still responsible for a woman who needed urgent medical attention. And now, the trail behind them was gone, obliterated by the landslide. As the adrenaline of their narrow escape began to fade, Isabel felt the full weight of their situation settle over her. They were truly on their own now, cut off from any hope of rescue coming up the mountain. Their only choice was to keep going down, to somehow find a way off this nightmare of a mountain before it was too late. With a groan of effort, Isabel pushed herself to her feet. Her body screamed in protest, every muscle aching, but she ignored it. They couldn't afford to rest, not yet. Not when they were still in danger. "Come on," she said, reaching down to help Mia up. "We have to keep moving." And so they continued their descent, 3 battered, exhausted women against the mountain. The landslide had changed the landscape, making navigation even more challenging. But Isabel was determined. They had come too far, survived too much to give up now. As they made their slow, painful way down the mountain, Isabel found herself thinking of home, of the warmth and safety that seemed so far away now. She thought of me, her worrying older sister, and felt a pang of regret for the fear she must be causing. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though I couldn't hear her. "I'm going to make it home. I promise." Little did she know that the most challenging part of their journey was yet to come. The mountain had one final, terrible test in store for them. One that would push them to the very limits of their endurance and humanity. As the day wore on, Isabel, Mia, and Rebecca continued their grueling descent. The landslide had forced them off the main trail, and they were now picking their way through unfamiliar terrain. Every step was a challenge, the ground treacherous underfoot, hidden dangers lurking behind every boulder and in every shadow. Rebecca's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her periods of consciousness were becoming shorter and less coherent. Isabel knew that if they didn't get her to medical help soon, they might lose her. This knowledge drove her forward, even as her own body screamed for rest. Mia was struggling too. Her injured ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and she could barely put any weight on it. But she refused to slow them down, gritting her teeth against the pain and pushing onward. As the light began to fade, signaling the approach of another dangerous night on the mountain, Isabel spotted something that made her heart leap with hope. A break in the trees ahead, and beyond that, what looked like a road. "Look," she cried, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I think we're almost there." Renewed energy surged through them at the prospect of rescue. They quickened their pace as much as their battered bodies would allow, the promise of safety drawing them onward. But the mountain had one last cruel trick to play. As they neared the edge of the forest, the ground suddenly gave way beneath their feet. Isabel felt a moment of weightlessness, a sensation of falling, and then impact. They had stumbled into a hidden sinkhole, likely caused by the heavy rains and shifting earth. They tumbled down a steep slope, unable to stop their descent. Isabel lost her grip on Rebecca, hearing the other woman's cry of pain as she rolled away. Rocks and branches tore at their skin and clothes as they fell. After what seemed like an eternity, they came to a stop at the bottom of the sinkhole. Isabel lay there for a moment, dazed and in pain, struggling to catch her breath. Then reality rushed back in and she scrambled to her feet, ignoring the protests of her battered body. "Mia! Rebecca!" she called out, panic rising in her throat. "Here," came Mia's weak reply from nearby. Isabel stumbled towards her friend's voice, finding Mia lying against a fallen log, her face contorted with pain. "My ankle," Mia gasped. "I think it's broken now." Isabel's heart sank. With Mia unable to walk, getting out of this sinkhole would be even more challenging. But they had no choice. They had to find a way. "Rebecca?" Isabel called again, scanning the dim interior of the sinkhole. A faint moan answered her. Following the sound, Isabel found Rebecca lying crumpled against the far wall of the sinkhole. The woman was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. As Isabel knelt beside her, she realized with horror that Rebecca's condition had worsened significantly in the fall. Her skin was cold and clammy, her pulse weak and erratic. She was in severe shock, and without immediate medical attention, she wouldn't survive much longer. Isabel looked up at the walls of the sinkhole. They were steep and slick with mud, offering no easy way out. The sinkhole was deep enough that calling for help was unlikely to be heard by anyone on the road above. In that moment, Isabel was faced with the most difficult decision of her life. They couldn't all get out of the sinkhole, not with Mia unable to walk and Rebecca barely clinging to life. But someone had to go for help, or they would all die here, so close to rescue yet impossibly far. Isabel felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. She looked at Mia, her friend who had stood by her through this entire ordeal, and at Rebecca, the stranger they had risked everything to save. The choice she had to make was impossible, yet necessary. "Mia," Isabel said, her voice trembling, "I have to go for help. You need to stay here with Rebecca. Keep her warm, keep her alive. I'll come back with rescue, I promise." Mia's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be okay. Just hurry." Isabel hugged her friend fiercely, then turned to the wall of the sinkhole. It was steep and slippery, but there were roots and rocks protruding from the earth that could serve as handholds. It would be a difficult climb, but it was their only chance. With a deep breath, Isabel began to climb. Her muscles screamed in protest, every movement sending jolts of pain through her battered body. The mud made it difficult to get a good grip, and more than once she slipped, her heart racing as she scrabbled for purchase on the treacherous slope. As she climbed, Isabel's mind raced with fears and doubts. What if she couldn't find help in time? What if she got lost trying to find the road? What if Mia and Rebecca didn't survive until she returned? The what-ifs threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed them aside, focusing solely on the next handhold, the next step. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Isabel's hand finally grasped the edge of the sinkhole. With a final, Herculean effort, she pulled herself up and over, collapsing onto solid ground. She lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, her limbs shaking with exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. Forcing herself to her feet, Isabel stumbled towards the road she had glimpsed earlier. The fading light made it difficult to see, but she pressed on, driven by desperation and the knowledge that 2 lives depended on her success. When her feet finally touched asphalt, Isabel could have wept with relief. She was on a road, a real, paved road that had to lead to civilization. But which way to go? In the gathering darkness, both directions looked equally promising and equally daunting. Isabel chose a direction at random and began to run. Her body protested every step, but she ignored the pain, focusing on the urgent need to find help. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. Then she ran some more. Just as she was about to collapse from exhaustion, Isabel saw something that made her heart leap. Headlights in the distance. A car was coming. She stumbled to the middle of the road, waving her arms frantically. The car slowed, then stopped. An older couple peered out at her, their faces a mix of concern and wariness. "Please," Isabel gasped, her voice ragged. "My friends, they're hurt. We need help." The next few hours passed in a blur. The couple called 911, and soon the quiet mountain road was alive with activity. Search and rescue teams arrived, along with paramedics and police. Isabel found herself repeating her story over and over, guiding a rescue team back to the sinkhole where Mia and Rebecca waited. The relief she felt when Mia and Rebecca were finally brought up from the sinkhole was overwhelming. Both were in bad shape, Mia with her broken ankle, Rebecca still dangerously hypothermic. But they were alive. As they were loaded into ambulances, Isabel finally allowed herself to believe that their ordeal was truly over. At the hospital, as doctors tended to her own injuries, Isabel was reunited with Mia. They held each other, crying and laughing at the same time, the full weight of their experience finally hitting them. "We made it," Mia said, her voice filled with wonder. "We actually made it." Isabel nodded, too overcome with emotion to speak. They had faced the mountain's fury, stared death in the face, and emerged victorious. The bond forged between them in those harrowing hours would last a lifetime. Later, they received news about Rebecca. She was in intensive care, but the doctors were cautiously optimistic about her recovery. Her family had been contacted and were on their way. Isabel and Mia's timely rescue had saved her life. As the adrenaline wore off and the reality of their survival sank in, Isabel found herself reflecting on the experience. The terror they had faced, the challenges they had overcome, had changed her in profound ways. She had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, faced fears she never knew she had. The mountain had tested them, pushed them to their limits and beyond. But in doing so, it had revealed the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Isabel knew she would carry the lessons learned on that mountain for the rest of her life. As she drifted off to sleep in her hospital bed, exhausted but profoundly grateful to be alive, Isabel's last thought was of the mountain. It stood silent and immovable, indifferent to the dramas that played out on its slopes. But for those who dared to challenge it, who faced its tests and emerged on the other side, it offered a unique gift, a deeper understanding of oneself and the indomitable strength of the human will. The terror in Colorado had changed Isabel forever. But in facing that terror, in overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds, she had discovered a truth about herself and about humanity that would stay with her always. In the days following their rescue, Isabel and Mia found themselves at the center of a media storm. Their story of survival against all odds had captured the public's imagination, and reporters clamored for interviews and details of their harrowing experience. Isabel, still processing the trauma of their ordeal, found the attention overwhelming. She gave a few brief statements, emphasizing the importance of proper preparation when hiking and the incredible work of the search and rescue teams. But mostly she focused on recovery, both physical and emotional. The physical toll of their adventure was significant. Isabel had suffered numerous cuts and bruises, a mild case of hypothermia, and a sprained wrist from her desperate climb out of the sinkhole. Mia's injuries were more severe. Her broken ankle required surgery, and she faced months of physical therapy. But it was the emotional impact that proved most challenging to navigate. Isabel found herself jumping at sudden noises, plagued by nightmares of falling and being buried alive. The sound of rain against the window could send her into a panic, her mind immediately transported back to that terrifying night on the mountain. Mia struggled too. Her usual carefree attitude was subdued, replaced by a newfound caution and anxiety. She blamed herself for their predicament, convinced that if she had worn proper hiking boots, things might have turned out differently. It was during one of their shared physical therapy sessions that Isabel finally broached the subject. "You know it's not your fault, right?" she said, watching Mia struggle through an exercise to rebuild strength in her ankle. Mia didn't meet her eyes. "If I had been better prepared..." "We were both underprepared," Isabel interrupted. "And yeah, maybe different shoes would have helped. But we couldn't have predicted that storm, or finding Rebecca, or any of it. We did the best we could with what we had." Mia was quiet for a long moment. "I keep thinking about what could have happened," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you hadn't found that sinkhole exit, if rescue hadn't come when it did." Isabel reached out, gripping her friend's hand. "But it didn't happen that way. We survived. We saved Rebecca. That's what matters." It was a conversation they would have many times over the coming weeks and months, each of them helping the other work through the guilt, fear, and lingering trauma of their experience. As they recovered, Isabel and Mia received updates on Rebecca's condition. The woman they had risked everything to save had pulled through, thanks in large part to their timely rescue. When she was well enough for visitors, Isabel and Mia went to see her. The reunion was emotional. Rebecca, still weak but on the road to recovery, broke down in tears as she thanked them for saving her life. "I don't remember much," she admitted, "but I know I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you two. How can I ever repay you?" Isabel shook her head. "There's no debt. We did what anyone would do." But even as she said it, Isabel knew it wasn't entirely true. Their decision to help, to risk their own lives for a stranger, had been a choice, one that not everyone would have made. It was a realization that filled her with a complex mix of pride and humility. In the months that followed, as they continued to heal and process their experience, Isabel, Mia, and Rebecca formed a bond that went beyond friendship. They had shared an experience that few could understand, faced death together, and emerged on the other side. It was a connection that would last a lifetime. Their story had another unexpected impact. It sparked a conversation about hiking safety and the importance of proper preparation. Local authorities used their experience as a cautionary tale, implementing new safety measures and education programs for hikers. Isabel found herself invited to speak at schools and outdoor clubs, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned. It was difficult at first, reliving the terror of those days on the mountain. But she came to see it as a way to give meaning to their ordeal, to perhaps prevent others from facing similar dangers. As the one-year anniversary of their rescue approached, Isabel, Mia, and Rebecca made a decision that surprised many. They announced their intention to return to the mountain. "We're not going to hike it," Isabel explained to me when she shared their plan. "We're just going to visit the base, to face it on our own terms." I was worried, of course. The thought of my sister returning to the place that had nearly claimed her life filled me with anxiety. But I also understood their need for closure, to reclaim some of the power that the mountain had taken from them. On a clear, sunny day, so different from the storm-racked afternoon of their original hike, Isabel, Mia, and Rebecca stood at the base of the mountain. They were silent for a long moment, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I never really saw it before, you know? I was so focused on the climb, on reaching the top. I never just looked at it." Mia nodded. "It's not our enemy," she said. "It's just itself. We were the ones who weren't prepared." Isabel felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she gazed up at the mountain peaks. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach that might never fully unravel. But there was something else too, a sense of respect, of understanding. "We faced you," she whispered, her words meant for the mountain and for herself. "We faced you, and we survived, and we'll never forget the lessons you taught us." As they turned to leave, Isabel felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The mountain would always be a part of her story, a defining moment in her life. But it no longer held power over her. She had faced her fears, confronted the trauma, and come out stronger on the other side. The terror in Colorado had changed them all. But in facing that terror, in overcoming it and helping each other heal, they had discovered strengths they never knew they possessed. It was a gift, hard-won and precious, that would guide them for the rest of their lives. As I sit here recounting my sister's incredible tale of survival, I'm struck by the profound impact it has had not just on Isabel, Mia, and Rebecca, but on our entire family and community. The echoes of those terrifying days in the Colorado mountains continue to resonate, shaping the way we view the world and our place in it. Isabel is not the same person she was before that fateful hiking trip. The carefree young woman who set out on what was supposed to be a simple adventure has been replaced by someone more thoughtful, more aware of the fragility of life and the importance of preparation. But she's also stronger, more confident in her ability to face challenges and overcome adversity. The experience has changed our family dynamic as well. We've always been close, but there's a new depth to our relationships now, a heightened appreciation for each other and for the time we have together. Every family gathering feels like a celebration of life and survival. Mia, too, has been transformed by the ordeal. Her recovery was long and difficult, but she approached it with a determination that impressed everyone around her. The experience seems to have focused her energy, giving her a new sense of purpose. She's now studying to become a wilderness guide, determined to help others experience the beauty of nature safely and responsibly. Rebecca's life took perhaps the most dramatic turn. Her brush with death led to a complete reevaluation of her priorities. She left her high-stress job in Chicago and moved to Colorado permanently, where she now works with search and rescue teams, using her own experience to help save others. The three of them, Isabel, Mia, and Rebecca, share a bond that goes beyond friendship. They meet regularly, sometimes just to talk, other times to hike, always well-prepared and on well-marked trails. They've become advocates for hiking safety, sharing their story as a cautionary tale, but also as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Their experience has had ripple effects throughout the community. Local authorities have implemented new safety measures for hikers, including more detailed trail markers and increased education programs. Outdoor equipment stores now offer free classes on wilderness survival and the importance of proper gear. As for me, hearing Isabel recount her story in detail was both horrifying and awe-inspiring. The terror she faced, the impossible decisions she had to make, the strength she found within herself, it all seems almost unbelievable. And yet I see the truth of it in her eyes, in the way she carries herself now, in the newfound purpose that drives her. I find myself looking at the world differently too. The comforts of daily life, which I once took for granted, now seem like precious gifts. Every time I hear rain against the window, I think of Isabel, Mia, and Rebecca huddled on that mountain, fighting for survival. It's a stark reminder of how quickly life can change, how thin the line is between safety and danger. But perhaps the most important lesson I've taken from Isabel's experience is the incredible capacity for human endurance and compassion. In the face of unimaginable hardship, my sister and her friends not only survived, but went above and beyond to help a stranger in need. They demonstrated the very best of humanity, resilience, selflessness, and an unwavering will to live. Their story has become a sort of modern parable in our community, a reminder of the unpredictability of life and the importance of facing our fears. It's a tale of terror, yes, but also one of triumph, over nature, over circumstance, and over the limitations we often place on ourselves. As I wrap up this account, I'm reminded of something Isabel said to me not long after her return. We were sitting on the porch, watching a summer storm roll in, when she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I used to think courage was about not being afraid. But I was wrong. Courage is about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. It's about facing your fears, not ignoring them." Those words have stayed with me, a profound truth born from harrowing experience. The terror in Colorado changed Isabel, changed all of us. But in facing that terror, in overcoming it and emerging stronger, we've gained a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. It's a reminder that while we can't always control the challenges life throws our way, we can control how we respond to them. We can choose courage over fear, action over paralysis, compassion over self-preservation. And in making those choices, we can discover strengths we never knew we had. As I look to the future, I know that whatever challenges come our way, we'll face them with the lessons learned from Isabel's incredible journey of survival. The echoes of terror from those Colorado mountains have transformed into a resounding affirmation of life, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit. And that, perhaps, is the most valuable lesson of all. I've always been drawn to the outdoors, finding solace in the whisper of wind through leaves and the crunch of earth beneath my feet. But there's something special, something almost magical, about hiking at night. The familiar trails transform under the cover of darkness, becoming alien landscapes full of mystery and potential danger. It's exhilarating, that dance between fear and wonder, as you navigate by moonlight and the narrow beam of a flashlight. I was 15 when I had my first real night hiking experience. Looking back, I realize how naive and unprepared I was, how close I came to real danger. But at the time, it felt like the greatest adventure of my young life. It was summer, and I was staying at a campground with my family and my best friend, Leo. We had spent the day swimming, fishing, and exploring the nearby trails. But as night fell, Leo and I found ourselves restless. The adults were gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows, but we yearned for something more exciting. "Hey," Leo whispered to me, his eyes glinting with mischief in the firelight. "What do you say we go for a night hike?" I hesitated for a moment. We were supposed to stay close to the campsite after dark, a rule my mom had been very clear about. But the idea was too tempting to resist. The forest at night, unexplored and full of possibilities, called to us like a siren's song. "Let's do it," I replied, a grin spreading across my face. We made our excuses to the adults, claiming we were tired and heading to bed early. Instead, we slipped into our tent, gathered our flashlights and water bottles, and waited for the perfect moment to make our escape. As we lay there in the darkness, listening to the muffled voices of our families and the crackling of the fire, Leo turned to me. "You ever been night hiking before?" he asked. I shook my head. "Nah, you?" "Once, with my dad," he replied. "It's intense, man. Everything looks different in the dark. Sounds different, too." His words sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine. I imagined the forest transformed, familiar landmarks taking on new and mysterious shapes in the moonlight. What would we see out there? What adventures awaited us? Finally, the voices around the campfire began to die down. We heard the sound of zippers as the adults retired to their tents. We waited a few more minutes, our hearts pounding with excitement and nerves, before silently slipping out of our tent. The night air was cool on my skin as we crept away from the campsite, The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie silver light over the landscape. As we reached the edge of the forest, I paused, suddenly aware of how different everything looked. The familiar trail that we had hiked earlier that day now seemed alien and foreboding. Leo must have sensed my hesitation. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch reassuring. "You okay?" he whispered. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, it's really different at night, isn't it?" He grinned, his teeth gleaming in the moonlight. "That's what makes it fun. Come on, let's go." And with that, we plunged into the darkness of the forest, leaving behind the safety of the campsite and stepping into a world of shadows and secrets. Little did we know that this adventure would soon turn into a nightmare, testing our courage and will to survive in ways we never could have imagined. As we made our way deeper into the forest, the sounds of the campsite faded away, replaced by the nocturnal symphony of the woods. Crickets chirped, owls hooted in the distance, and the wind whispered through the leaves overhead. Our flashlights carved narrow paths through the darkness, illuminating patches of trail and creating dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. I felt a mix of exhilaration and unease. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump, my imagination conjuring images of lurking predators or other, less natural threats. But there was also a thrill to it all, a sense of being truly alive and awake in a world that most people never experienced. "This is awesome," I whispered to Leo, not wanting to break the spell of the night with loud voices. He nodded, his eyes wide as he scanned the trail ahead. "Yeah, it's like we're the only people in the world right now." Little did we know how wrong that statement would prove to be, or how much we would soon wish it were true. As we continued our hike, blissfully unaware of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, we were about to learn a harsh lesson about the perils of the wilderness and the folly of unprepared adventure. We had been hiking for about an hour when I first noticed something was off. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of unease that crept over me like a cold shadow. I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. "Hey, Leo," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the ambient sounds of the forest. "Does something feel weird to you?" Leo paused, his flashlight beam sweeping the trail ahead. "What do you mean?" I shrugged, feeling foolish but unable to shake the growing sense of discomfort. "I don't know. It's just a feeling, I guess. Like we're being watched or something." Leo laughed, but it sounded forced. "Man, you've been watching too many horror movies. It's just the dark playing tricks on you." I tried to laugh it off, but the unease persisted. We continued on, our pace slowing as we navigated a particularly rocky section of the trail. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Faint, but unmistakable. The rhythmic crunch of leaves and twigs under human feet coming from somewhere behind us. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. "Leo!" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. "Yeah, I heard it. It's probably just another hiker." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Who else would be out here, on this remote trail in the middle of the night? We stood still, straining our ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the normal sounds of the forest. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I had imagined it, we heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. "Dude, there's someone following us," Leo whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. I wanted to dismiss his concern, to be the voice of reason, but I couldn't. The footsteps were real, and they were getting closer. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Leo nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah, let's go." We turned and started back the way we had come, our pace quickening with each step. The footsteps behind us seemed to speed up too, matching our increased tempo. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was it a ranger, angry at us for being out after hours? A fellow camper with sinister intentions? Or something else entirely? Something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares? As we hurried along the trail, I became acutely aware of how vulnerable we were. Two teenage boys, alone in the wilderness, with nothing but small flashlights to defend ourselves. I cursed silently, remembering the knife I had left back at the campsite. It probably wouldn't have made much difference, but its absence made me feel even more helpless. We came to a section of the trail that ran alongside a dense patch of brush. As we passed it, the footsteps behind us suddenly stopped. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Maybe whoever it was had given up, turned back. Then we heard it. A rustle in the brush, right next to us. And then, unmistakably, the sound of human footsteps, mere feet away, separated from us only by the thin screen of vegetation. Leo and I exchanged a terrified glance. There was no doubt now. This was no animal, no trick of the mind. There was someone in those woods, someone who had been following us, and now they were right there, just out of sight. In that moment, all thoughts of bravery or curiosity vanished. Pure, primal fear took over. Without a word, we turned and ran, our feet pounding the trail, our breath coming in ragged gasps. We ran like we had never run before, driven by the kind of fear that bypasses all rational thought and taps directly into our most basic survival instincts. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of our terror. All I knew was that we had to get away, had to reach safety. Finally, mercifully, we burst out of the forest and onto the road that led back to our campsite. We paused there, bent over and gasping for breath, our legs trembling from the exertion. Do you think we lost them?" Leo panted, looking back at the dark line of trees. I shook my head, still struggling to catch my breath. "I don't know. I don't hear anything now." We stood there for a few moments, listening intently. The forest was quiet now, almost unnaturally so. Whatever had been following us seemed to have vanished. "We should get back to camp," I said, finally feeling my heartbeat start to slow. Leo nodded, his face still pale with fear. "Yeah, let's go." As we started down the road towards our campsite, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. We had escaped whatever was in those woods, but the night's terrors were far from over. Little did we know that our encounter with the mysterious follower was just the beginning, and that nature had an even more frightening ordeal in store for us. The road back to the campsite stretched before us, a ribbon of pale moonlight cutting through the darkness. We walked quickly, constantly glancing over our shoulders, jumping at every sound. The fear of our unseen pursuer still thrummed through our veins, urging us to keep moving, to reach the safety of our camp. But as we were about to learn in the wilderness, there is no such thing as true safety, and sometimes the dangers you can see are far more terrifying than those that lurk in the shadows. As we hurried along the road back to our campsite, I felt a mix of emotions churning inside me. Relief at having escaped our mysterious pursuer warred with lingering fear and the growing certainty that we were in way over our heads. The adrenaline that had fueled our mad dash through the forest was starting to wear off, leaving me feeling shaky and vulnerable. "Leo," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. "What do you think that was back there?" Leo shook his head, his face still pale in the moonlight. "I don't know, man. Maybe a homeless person? Or some crazy hunter?" I shuddered at the possibilities. The idea of someone stalking us through the dark forest was terrifying enough without trying to imagine their motives. We walked in silence for a few minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. The road stretched endlessly before us, and I found myself wishing we had never left the campsite. What had seemed like an exciting adventure just hours ago now felt like a terrible mistake. That's when we heard it, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Footsteps. Not the two-legged gait of our previous pursuer, but the soft pad of animal feet on the forest floor. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, grabbing Leo's arm. He nodded, his eyes wide with renewed fear. "Yeah. What do you think it is?" Before I could answer, we heard more footsteps, coming from different directions. And then, in a moment that will be forever etched in my memory, I saw them. Pairs of glowing eyes reflecting the light of our flashlights, surrounding us in the darkness. "Coyotes," Leo breathed, his voice barely audible. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had heard stories about coyotes, knew they could be dangerous, especially in packs. But I had never encountered them like this, had never felt the primal fear of being surrounded by predators in the wild. "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Leo, I remembered with a surge of hope, was an experienced hunter. He had been on camping and hunting trips with his father since he was young. If anyone knew how to handle this situation, it would be him. "We need to stay calm," Leo said, his voice steadier than I expected. "Don't run. That'll just trigger their chase instinct. We need to make ourselves look big and intimidating." Following Leo's lead, I raised my arms above my head, trying to make myself appear as large as possible. We began to slowly back away, maintaining eye contact with the coyotes nearest to us. "Make noise," Leo instructed. "Yell, clap, anything to scare them off." We began to shout, our voices echoing in the night. I clapped my hands together, the sharp sound cutting through the air. The coyotes hesitated, some taking a step back, but they didn't flee. As we continued our slow retreat, I counted the glowing eyes around us. 7, maybe 8 pairs. A large pack, more than enough to take down prey much larger than 2 teenage boys. "They're stalking us," Leo said, his voice tight with tension, just like they would any other prey. The realization sent a fresh wave of fear through me. We weren't just in danger, we were being hunted. We continued our slow, steady pace, never turning our backs on the coyotes. They followed, matching our speed, some darting in closer before retreating again. It was like a deadly dance, with us as the unwilling partners. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every step felt like a mile, every moment pregnant with the possibility of attack. My arms ached from holding them up, my throat raw from shouting, but I didn't dare stop. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when the strain of maintaining our defensive posture was becoming unbearable, I saw something that filled me with hope. The glow of our campfire in the distance. "Leo," I gasped. "I can see the camp. We're almost there." He nodded, not taking his eyes off the coyotes. "Okay, we're going to make a run for it. On my signal, drop your arms and sprint as fast as you can. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Ready?" I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Now!" Leo shouted. We dropped our arms and ran. I had never run so fast in my life, my feet barely seeming to touch the ground. I could hear the coyotes behind us, their paws pounding the earth, their excited yips filling the air. The campfire grew larger, brighter. I could make out the shapes of tents now, could almost feel the safety they represented. But the sounds behind us were getting closer. The coyotes, freed from our intimidation tactics, had fully embraced the chase. Just as I felt sure they would overtake us, we burst into the clearing of our campsite. The sudden light, the presence of humans and tents, and the crackling fire seemed to confuse the coyotes. They pulled up short at the edge of the clearing, milling about in confusion. "Mom!" I screamed, my voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "Help!" Lights flicked on in the tents. I heard confused voices, the sound of zippers being hastily opened. And then my mom was there, rushing towards us with a mixture of anger and concern on her face. "What on earth?" she began, but then she saw the coyotes at the edge of the clearing. Her eyes widened in understanding and fear. What happened next was a blur. There was shouting, the clanging of pots and pans as the adults tried to scare off the coyotes. Eventually, reluctantly, the pack melted back into the shadows of the forest, leaving us trembling in the safety of the campsite. As the adrenaline wore off, the full weight of what we had just experienced hit me. We had faced not one, but two potentially deadly encounters in a single night. The mysterious follower in the woods, the pack of hunting coyotes. It all seemed too much to process. My mom hugged me tightly, her anger at our disobedience overshadowed by relief at our safe return. As she held me, I felt the last of my bravado crumble. I began to shake uncontrollably, the delayed reaction to the night's terrors finally setting in. "What were you thinking?" my mom asked, her voice a mix of concern and exasperation. "Do you have any idea how dangerous it is to go hiking at night?" I couldn't answer. The words stuck in my throat as I tried to process everything that had happened. How could I explain the foolish bravado that had led us into the woods, the paralyzing fear we had felt when we realized we were being followed, the primal terror of being hunted by the coyote pack? Leo's parents had emerged from their tent as well, and soon both of us were surrounded by worried adults peppering us with questions. We did our best to recount our experience, our voices shaky and our words tumbling out in a disjointed narrative. As we spoke, I saw the adults exchange worried glances. The idea of someone following us in the woods clearly disturbed them as much as it had us. And while coyotes were known to inhabit the area, a pack bold enough to stalk humans was cause for serious concern. "We need to report this to the park rangers," Leo's dad said, his face grim. "Both the person in the woods and the coyote pack. This isn't something we can ignore." The next few hours passed in a blur. Park rangers were called, reports were filed, and Leo and I had to recount our story several more times. The rangers took our account of the person following us very seriously, promising to increase patrols in the area. As for the coyotes, they explained that while attacks on humans were rare, a pack displaying such bold behavior was potentially dangerous and would need to be monitored closely. As the excitement died down and the adults began to disperse back to their tents, I found myself sitting by the rekindled campfire, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. Leo joined me, his face still pale in the flickering light. "That was intense," he said, his voice low. "I've never been that scared in my life." I nodded, staring into the flames. "Me neither. When those coyotes were chasing us, I really thought we might die." We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The forest around us, which had seemed so inviting during the day, now felt ominous and threatening. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me tense up, wondering if our mysterious stalker or the coyote pack had returned. "You know," Leo said after a while, "my dad always told me that the wilderness demands respect. I guess I never really understood what he meant until tonight." His words resonated with me. We had treated our night hike like a game, an exciting adventure without considering the very real dangers we might face. Nature, we had learned, could be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Do you think we'll ever find out who was following us?" I asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at me. Leo shrugged. "I don't know. Part of me hopes we do, just to know. But another part, maybe it's better not knowing, you know?" I understood what he meant. The not knowing was unsettling, but the possibilities my imagination conjured were perhaps even more terrifying than the reality. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. The adrenaline that had kept us going had long since worn off, leaving us drained both physically and emotionally. But even as my eyelids grew heavy, I found myself reluctant to return to the tent. The darkness inside seemed too reminiscent of the forest that had so recently turned from a playground into a nightmare. We should probably try to get some sleep, Leo said, stifling a yawn. But honestly, I don't know if I can. Yeah, I agreed. Every time I close my eyes, I see those coyotes' eyes staring at us. We ended up staying by the fire until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. As the world slowly brightened around us, I felt some of the fear and tension of the night begin to ebb away. In the light of day, our ordeal seemed almost dreamlike, though the lingering fear in the pit of my stomach reminded me it had been all too real. That morning, as our families began to stir and the campsite came to life, there was a lot of discussion about what to do next. Some wanted to pack up and leave immediately, feeling that the area was no longer safe. Others, including the park rangers who had returned to check on us, argued that the incident, while frightening, was isolated and that there was no need to cut our trip short. In the end, we decided to stay, though with some new ground rules. No one was to go hiking alone, and night hikes were strictly forbidden. The rangers increased their patrols of the area, both to look for signs of our mysterious follower and to monitor the coyote pack's movements. As for Leo and me, the experience had changed us. The carefree excitement we had felt at the beginning of our night hike had been replaced by a newfound respect for the wilderness and its inherent dangers. We spent the rest of our camping trip sticking close to the adults, jumping at shadows and sleeping with one eye open. It would be years before I could enjoy a night hike again, and even then, the memories of that terrifying night would come flooding back at the slightest unusual sound. The incident served as a harsh but valuable lesson about the importance of preparation, respect for nature, and the very real dangers that can lurk in the shadows of the wilderness. In the days and weeks following our harrowing night in the woods, I found myself replaying the events over and over in my mind. The initial excitement of our secret night hike, the growing unease as we realized we were being followed, the heart-pounding terror of being surrounded by the coyote pack. Each moment was etched into my memory with crystal clarity. The incident had a profound effect on both Leo and me. We had gone into the woods as carefree teenagers, confident in our ability to handle whatever adventure came our way. We emerged with a newfound respect for the power of nature and a keen awareness of our own vulnerability. For a while after we returned home, I struggled with nightmares. I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear footsteps outside my window or see glowing eyes in the darkness of my room. My parents, concerned about the impact the experience had had on me, suggested I talk to a counselor. At first, I resisted, not wanting to appear weak or traumatized. But eventually I agreed, and found that talking through the experience helped me process my feelings and begin to move past the fear. Leo dealt with the aftermath in his own way. He threw himself into learning more about wilderness survival and animal behavior. He read books, watched documentaries, and even convinced his dad to enroll him in a wilderness skills course. It was as if by arming himself with knowledge, he could ensure he would never be caught unprepared in the wild again. As for the mysteries of that night, some were resolved, while others remained tantalizingly out of reach. The park rangers never did find any trace of the person who had followed us in the woods. No other hikers reported similar experiences, and over time, the incident was chalked up to an isolated occurrence. But the uncertainty lingered, a reminder that even in familiar places, the unknown can lurk just out of sight. The coyote pack, on the other hand, became something of a local legend. Park rangers tracked their movements for months afterward, noting that while the pack remained in the area, they showed no further unusual interest in humans. Experts theorized that our encounter had been a rare instance of the pack's natural curiosity overcoming their usual wariness of humans. Still, warning signs were posted throughout the park, advising hikers on how to deal with coyote encounters. As time passed, the raw fear of that night began to fade, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the experience. I came to see it not just as a terrifying ordeal, but as a powerful lesson in respect for nature and the importance of preparation. I remembered something my grandfather, an avid outdoorsman, had once told me. Nature isn't good or bad, kind or cruel. It simply is. It's up to us to understand and respect it, to know its beauty and its dangers. Those words took on new meaning for me after our night in the woods. I realized that our mistake hadn't been in wanting to explore, to experience the thrill of a night hike. Our mistake had been in treating the wilderness as a playground, underestimating its potential dangers and overestimating our ability to handle them. This realization didn't diminish my love for the outdoors. If anything, it deepened it. I began to see the natural world not just as a backdrop for adventures, but as a complex, powerful force worthy of respect and careful study. Like Leo, I found myself drawn to learning more about wilderness survival and the behavior of wild animals. Each piece of knowledge felt like a shield against future dangers, a way to ensure I would never again find myself as unprepared and vulnerable as I had been that night. As I grew older, I continued to hike and camp, but with a new awareness and respect for the wilderness. I made sure to always be properly prepared, to understand the potential risks of each excursion, and to never underestimate the unpredictability of nature. The experience also taught me valuable lessons about fear and courage. I learned that bravery isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. When we were surrounded by the coyote pack, it was Leo's knowledge and calm leadership that had likely saved our lives. He had been just as terrified as I was, but he had found the courage to remember his training and take action. This lesson served me well beyond my outdoor adventures. In facing challenges in school, work, and life in general, I often found myself drawing on the inner strength I had discovered that night. If I could face down a pack of coyotes, I told myself, I could handle a difficult exam or a tough job interview. Looking back now, years later, I can see how that one night changed the course of my life in many ways. It sparked a deeper interest in nature and conservation, leading me to study environmental science in college. It taught me the value of preparation and respect for the unknown. And perhaps most importantly, it showed me that I was capable of facing my fears and overcoming seemingly impossible challenges. The terror I felt that night in the woods has long since faded. But the lessons I learned about nature, about fear, about myself, have stayed with me, shaping the person I've become. That moonlit trail, with its hidden follower and glowing eyes in the darkness, led me not just back to safety, but toward a greater understanding of the world and my place in it. As I sit here, recounting this story, I'm struck by how a single night, a single decision to step off the safe, well-lit path, can have such a profound and lasting impact. Our adventure in the woods was a reminder that the line between excitement and terror, between an amusing anecdote and a cautionary tale, can be razor thin. For those who might be tempted to seek out similar thrills, to test themselves against the wild unknown, I offer this story not as a deterrent, but as a call for respect and preparation. The wilderness is indeed full of wonders and opportunities for adventure, but it demands our respect, our caution, and our understanding. The footsteps that followed us that night, the glowing eyes that surrounded us, they are more than just elements of a frightening story. They are reminders of the unknown that exists just beyond the reach of our flashlights, of the thin veneer of safety that separates us from the wild. They are calls to approach the natural world not with fear, but with wonder, respect, and a healthy dose of caution. In the end, the most important thing I learned from that night is this: the greatest adventures, the most profound experiences, often come with an element of risk. But it's how we prepare for that risk, how we face it, and what we learn from it that truly matters. That night in the woods was the most terrifying experience of my young life, but it was also one of the most transformative. The impact of our night of terror wasn't confined to just Leo and me. It rippled outward, affecting our families, our community, and even the way the local authorities managed the wilderness areas. For my mother, the incident was a wake-up call. She had always been protective, but now her concern took on a new intensity. For weeks after we returned home, she would check on me multiple times during the night, as if afraid I might disappear into the darkness. It took time and many conversations for her to regain her trust in my judgment and ability to stay safe. Leo's parents reacted differently. His father, an experienced outdoorsman, saw the incident as a harsh but necessary lesson. He doubled down on teaching Leo wilderness skills, taking him on more frequent camping trips and enrolling him in advanced survival courses. Leo's mother, on the other hand, became more hesitant about outdoor activities, always insisting on extensive safety measures before any trip. In our wider circle of friends and acquaintances, the story of our night in the woods took on a life of its own. It was retold, embellished, and sometimes distorted, becoming a sort of local urban legend. I heard versions where the coyotes had actually attacked us, where the mysterious follower had revealed themselves, even one outlandish tale where we had stumbled upon a secret government facility in the woods. While these exaggerated versions of our experience were frustrating, they did serve a purpose. They got people talking about wilderness safety, about the importance of proper preparation and respect for nature. Local outdoor equipment stores reported an uptick in sales of safety gear and wilderness survival guides. The community center even started offering classes on outdoor safety and wildlife awareness. The incident also had a significant impact on the management of the park where we had our encounter. The rangers, true to their word, increased their patrols, particularly during night hours. They installed more informational signs about wildlife behavior and safety procedures. The coyote pack that had stalked us became the subject of a long-term study, with researchers tracking their movements and behavior to better understand what had led to our unusual encounter. All of these changes, these ripples spreading out from our experience, served as constant reminders of that night. For a long time, I found it difficult to escape the shadow of what had happened. Every time I saw a new safety sign in the park or overheard someone talking about coyote sightings, I was transported back to those terrifying moments on the trail. But as time passed, I began to see these reminders not as triggers for fear, but as testaments to the power of our experience to create positive change. Our misadventure had led to increased awareness, better safety measures, and a community more educated about the wilderness in their backyard. In a way, the fear we had felt that night was being transformed into knowledge and preparedness for others. This realization was a turning point for me. It helped me start to see our experience not just as a personal trauma to be overcome, but as a valuable lesson that could benefit others. I began to share our story more openly, not as a tale of terror, but as a cautionary example of the importance of respect and preparation in the wilderness. I started volunteering with local conservation groups, helping to educate people about wildlife behavior and safe hiking practices. Each time I spoke to a group of eager hikers or wide-eyed schoolchildren, I felt like I was turning our negative experience into something positive, using it to help others avoid the mistakes we had made. Leo, too, found ways to channel his experience into something constructive. His newfound passion for wilderness skills led him to become a junior park ranger during summers. He took particular pride in leading educational programs about coyote behavior and coexistence with wildlife. As the years went by, the acute fear and trauma of that night faded, replaced by a deeper, more nuanced understanding of nature and our place in it. The wilderness was no longer a realm of nameless terrors for me, but a complex, beautiful, and sometimes dangerous world that demanded respect and understanding. I continued to hike and camp, but now with a heightened awareness of my surroundings and a deep appreciation for proper preparation. Each trip into the backcountry became an opportunity not just for adventure, but for deepening my connection with the natural world. There were times, especially on night hikes, which I eventually found the courage to attempt again, when the memories of that night would come flooding back. The snap of a twig or the distant howl of a coyote could still send a shiver down my spine. But now, these moments of fear were tempered by knowledge and experience. I had learned to distinguish between the normal sounds of the forest at night and potential threats, to understand the behavior of the animals I might encounter. In a way, the lingering echoes of that night of terror became a sort of sixth sense, an extra layer of awareness that made me a more careful and respectful visitor to the wilderness. The fear hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into a tool for safety and a deeper appreciation of the wild. As I reflect on all of this, the terror of that night, the long process of coming to terms with what happened, and the unexpected positive changes that resulted, I'm struck by the complex relationship we have with fear and the unknown. That night in the woods forced me to confront the limits of my courage and knowledge, but it also opened up new paths of understanding and growth. I sometimes wonder about the person who followed us in the woods that night. Who were they? What were their intentions? These questions may never be answered, and in a way, I've come to appreciate the mystery. It stands as a reminder that there will always be unknowns in life, especially in the wilderness. The key is not to let that uncertainty paralyze us with fear, but to let it inspire us to be more prepared, more aware, and more respectful of the world around us. As for the coyotes, I've since learned much more about their behavior and ecology. I understand now that their actions that night, while terrifying to us, were likely a combination of curiosity and testing potential prey. This knowledge doesn't negate the fear I felt, but it does put it into perspective. It reminds me that in the natural world, there are no villains, only creatures acting according to their nature and needs. Looking back on that night from the vantage point of years, I can see how it shaped the person I've become. The terrified 15-year-old boy who ran from shadows in the woods has grown into a man with a deep respect for nature, a commitment to conservation, and a nuanced understanding of the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. That night on the trail was indeed a tale of terror, but it was also so much more. It was a turning point, a harsh but effective teacher, and ultimately a gift. It taught me about courage, respect, and the profound beauty and power of the natural world. It showed me that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our most frightening experiences. As I finish recounting this story, I'm reminded of a quote by the naturalist John Muir: "The clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness." That night, lost in the dark woods with unknown dangers all around, I began a journey into a deeper understanding of the universe and my place in it. It's a journey that continues to this day. With every step I take on a forest trail, every howl I hear in the distance, and every moment of wonder I experience in the great outdoors. The shadows in the night may still hold terrors, but they also hold invaluable lessons for those brave enough to face them. My adventure taught me that the key is not to avoid the darkness, but to enter it with respect, preparation, and an open mind. For it's often in the deepest shadows that we find our greatest opportunities for growth and understanding. Years have passed since that fateful night in the woods, but its impact continues to shape my life in ways both subtle and profound. As I've grown older, pursued my education, and started my career, I've found that the lessons learned during those terrifying hours frequently resurface, offering guidance and perspective in unexpected situations. I chose to study environmental science in college, a decision directly influenced by my experience. My classes on ecology and wildlife behavior often brought me back to that night, providing scientific context for what we had encountered. Learning about coyote social structures and hunting behaviors helped me understand the pack dynamics we had witnessed. Studies on human-wildlife conflict gave me insight into why our presence might have triggered such an unusual response from the animals. But it wasn't just the academic knowledge that proved valuable. The emotional resilience and problem-solving skills I had developed in the aftermath of our ordeal served me well in the challenging world of academia. When faced with daunting research projects or difficult exams, I would remind myself, if I could face down a pack of coyotes, I can handle this. After college, I landed a job with a wildlife conservation organization. My role involved educating the public about coexisting with wildlife in urban and suburban areas. Time and again, I found myself drawing on my personal experience to connect with people, to help them understand that fear of wildlife often stems from misunderstanding. I remember one particular community meeting about a coyote population that had moved into a suburban area. Residents were panicked, calling for the animals to be removed or even killed. As I stood up to speak, I felt a flutter of nervousness in my stomach, reminiscent of the fear I had felt that night in the woods. But I took a deep breath and began to share our story. I told them about our night of terror, not holding back on the fear we had felt. I saw recognition in their eyes. This was the kind of encounter they were afraid of. But then I went on to explain what I had learned since then, about coyote behavior, about the rarity of attacks on humans, about the vital role these animals play in the ecosystem. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted. While some residents were still wary, many had moved from fear to curiosity. They asked questions about how to safely coexist with coyotes, about what to do if they encountered one. It was a small victory, but an important one. I had used my own fear and experience to help others move past theirs, to foster understanding rather than conflict. This pattern repeated itself throughout my career. Whether I was leading nature walks, consulting on wildlife management plans, or writing educational materials, my experience that night gave me a unique perspective. I could bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and visceral experience, between respect for wildlife and understanding of human fears. On a personal level, my relationship with the outdoors continued to evolve. I never lost my love for hiking and camping, but my approach to these activities was forever changed. Every trip into the backcountry became an exercise in mindfulness and preparation. I took courses in wilderness first aid and navigation. I invested in quality gear and always made sure to leave detailed trip plans with loved ones. But beyond these practical measures, I developed a deeper, more spiritual connection with nature. Having faced its dangers, having felt small and vulnerable in its vastness, I gained a profound appreciation for the natural world's beauty and power. Nights in the wilderness, once a source of terror, became opportunities for reflection and wonder. I learned to distinguish the different calls of night birds, to appreciate the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, to gaze in awe at star-filled skies unobscured by city lights. The darkness that had once held nameless threats now felt like a velvet cloak, mysterious but not malevolent. Of course, there were still moments of fear. The first time I heard a coyote howl while camping alone, I felt my heart race and my palms grow sweaty. But now I had the knowledge and experience to contextualize these feelings. I could acknowledge the fear without being controlled by it, could appreciate the wild beauty of the sound even as it triggered memories of that long-ago night. As I've grown older, I've also gained a greater appreciation for the role that night played in shaping my character. The courage and quick thinking that Leo and I displayed, the resilience we showed in the aftermath, these were qualities that served us well in adulthood. The empathy we developed for each other during our shared ordeal translated into stronger, more compassionate relationships in all areas of our lives. Leo and I have remained close friends over the years, bonded by our shared experience. We make a point of getting together at least once a year for a camping trip. These outings are a chance to reconnect, to reflect on how far we've come, and to honor the lessons we learned in the darkness of the forest. On our most recent trip, as we sat by the campfire sharing stories and roasting marshmallows, Leo turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I sometimes wonder who we would have become if that night had never happened. If we'd just gone to sleep in our tent like we were supposed to." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I think about that too," I replied. "It's strange to be grateful for something that was so terrifying at the time." "But we are grateful, aren't we?" Leo said, poking at the fire with a stick. "I mean, I wouldn't want to go through it again, but I can't deny how much it shaped us." As I looked into the flickering flames, I felt a profound sense of agreement. That night of terror, as traumatic as it had been, had set us on paths we might never have found otherwise. It had taught us respect for nature, the value of preparation, the importance of facing our fears. It had shown us the strength we possessed, strengths we might never have discovered in easier circumstances. "You're right," I said finally. "I am grateful, not for the fear itself, but for what came after. for what it taught us. As we lapsed into companionable silence, the fire crackling before us and the night sounds of the forest all around, I felt a deep sense of peace. The wilderness that had once been a source of terror had become a place of solace and self-discovery. The fears we had faced had transformed into tools for growth and understanding. Our night of terror on the trail had indeed been a crucible, a test of our courage and resilience. But it had also been a gift, one that continued to give long after the immediate danger had passed. It had taught us to respect the wild, to prepare for the unexpected, and to face our fears with courage and determination. As I gazed up at the star-filled sky, I felt a profound sense of connection to the earth beneath my feet, to the forest around me, to the friend beside me, and to the scared but brave boys we had once been. The shadows of that long-ago night had transformed into a light that continued to guide us, illuminating our path through the complex, beautiful, sometimes frightening, but always awe-inspiring wilderness of life.